Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Science of Monster Hunter, which is, I guess, what we're calling this series. A little late to decide because I realize I've been doing this for over a year now. But today we're going to cover Rey Dau, who is one of my favorite designs in the entire series, just because of how much love and care is put into it. It's a really, really amazing critter. And while Legiacris will probably always be my favorite, Rey Dau for sure is a very strong contender for second, just because of how well thought out the design is, how many real biological principles they incorporate into this animal, from things like functional morphology to the way that its organs are arranged inside of its body. It's just really, really incredible. If you're coming back, then you already know who I am, but if you're new here, I'm Dryptosaurus, I do paleontology, and I cover a range of topics on this channel, from video game stuff like this to just, current science and some interesting stories from this field. Keep in mind, I am just one person. Nothing on here is really fact-checked, so I count on everybody in the comments to call me out if I get something wrong. I don't know everything about every animal I'm going to make comparisons to. My field of expertise is quite narrow. And so if you see something that from your experience might not be correct, please tell me. Science is a dialogue, or in most cases, I don't know what a multi-person dialogue would be called, like a Socratic discussion. But yeah, if you have an opinion that you'd like to share, please do so in the comments. Without further ado, let's get into one of the coolest flying wyverns ever released, if not the coolest, Rey Dau. So first we're going to start out, as we always do, with setting a binomial. I do this every time I talk about one of these animals because I'm treating them as though they were real organisms, and we give every real organism a binomial name in the field of biology and paleontology. The binomial name is made up of a genus, which is the capitalized part, and this lowercase part, which is the species. That's why we're not capitalizing the second part of the binomial, because I'm splitting the common name Rey Dau into a genus, Rey, and a species, Dau. That means that if they created another species that belonged to the same genus in the future, it would be Rey, and then whatever species it was. It wouldn't get its own binomial if it fell into the same genus. One thing I get asked a lot is how come some of the scientific names are so different from what we commonly call these animals? Why isn't the binomial name for bald eagle, bald eagle? Well, the answer is typically because a lot of animals have a variety of common names, and one common name might map onto multiple species, or one species might have multiple common names, and so it just doesn't really make a lot of sense in most cases to translate that. Also, when they were first giving all these animals binomial names, they mostly did it in Latin. Nowadays, it's actually quite a wide range of languages that are accepted for use. We're seeing a lot of binomials that take inspiration from Mandarin. A big trend right now, which I absolutely agree with because I think it's really cool, is to give the animal a binomial name in the indigenous language of the place that it was found. You find an animal in Spain, name it in Spanish. You find an animal on Navajo land, you name it in Dene. You find an animal in, I don't know, Brazil, you can name it in Quechua or Nahuatl. I don't know if they speak Nahuatl in Brazil. That's a question for another video. I'll Google that. Yeah, I don't know if the Mexica Empire got that far south. Anyway, you get what I mean. There's a lot of different names that we can use. So here I've just, imported the common name and made that the binomial. How often does that happen? Are there any actual animals that, rather than having a really convoluted long binomial name compared to a short and snappy common name, have a binomial that matches their common name exactly? Now, surprisingly, yes. So we have right here this beautiful snake. This is a boa constrictor. The binomial name of boa constrictor is boa constrictor. And I think that's actually because the common name is derived from the binomial and not the other way around, but I could be wrong. But yeah, so boa is the genus, constrictor is the species. Next, we have the American alligator, also known as the Mississippi alligator, which is called alligator. That's the genus name. And then the two species of alligator are broken into Mississippiensis, for the alligator that you would find in Mississippi and the rest of the United States, as well as some parts of Mexico. I believe. And then the alligator that you would find in China, which is Alligator sinensis, which means Chinese alligator. Um, the suffix ensis means that it comes from that place. For example, when we're talking about Nanotyrannus lancensis, it means little tyrant from the lance formation. Then we have my favorite scientific name of all time, which is the Western Lowland gorilla. And that means this animal belongs in the genus gorilla. Its species is gorilla. And then the subspecies of that species is gorilla. This animal's scientific name is gorilla, gorilla, gorilla. And every time you want to talk about it in a paper and you're mentioning this subspecies specifically, you will call it gorilla, 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 or G gorilla, gorilla, which is the coolest thing ever. I love it. The tokay gecko has something very similar going on. The name gecko actually comes from the sound that the tokay gecko makes. The word tokay also comes from that. But the genus name for the tokay gecko is gecko, and the species name is gecko. So a lot of animals have this repeated like genus into species name. But yeah, that's something that happens with gorilla. And of course, we have the most popular animal of all time that has a binomial which matches its common name, that being Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, for a very long time, there was actually no reason to really refer to this animal as Tyrannosaurus rex. This art is beautiful. It's by Wyatt Andrews. This one's by Mark Whitten, an awesome paleontologist. And this one's also by Mark Whitten. These are my art credits. But anyway, for a long time, there was no real reason to refer to Tyrannosaurus rex as Tyrannosaurus rex as opposed to just Tyrannosaurus, because it's what we would call a monotypic genus. It's a genus that only contains one species. For example, if you have a box that includes 40 different things, and you want to talk about one of those things in the box, you're going to say box number 1, item 40, right? But if you only have one thing in the box, you can really just say, yeah, can you give me the thing in box 1? For a long time, Tyrannosaurus, the genus, was a box that only had one item in it, Tyrannosaurus rex. And so I really don't know why the trend of calling it Tyrannosaurus rex ever really started, but it's a good one because Tyrannosaurus rex sounds awesome. It's a great name. But until very recently, there was only ever one species, and so it was unique in that its common name for dinosaurs, they're usually just referred to by genus because most dinosaur genera are monotypic. I say genera. Some people say genuses. I don't care which one you say. But for a while, there was really no reason to do that. But now we have split Tyrannosaurus into two species, Tyrannosaurus rex and Tyrannosaurus micrayensis. We'll see if those actually stick around. I've heard mixed feelings on that decision, and some people are compelled to believe that Tyrannosaurus rex really is the only known species of Tyrannosaurus. So we'll see how that shakes out. But regardless, that's the way it is, and Tyrannosaurus rex has been referred to as T-Rex for a very, very long time, and to the point where that's the common name. So I named it Rey Dau because that's what it's called by the local people. However, why did the Monster Hunter developers name it Rey Dau? Well, and if you're here for the science, I apologize for talking about etymology for almost 10 minutes, but etymology is important. Learning how words are constructed it's good. It helps you come up with new words if you're a writer. But the word Rey Dao in Monster Hunter seems to be derived from either the Spanish Rey, which means king, or the Chinese Le, which is the same meaning, and the Arabic Dao, which means light. Now, I personally think that they chose the Spanish one for this. A lot of Monster Hunter names have roots in Chinese. However, Rey Dao lives in a place called the Windward Plains, which is very, very similar environmentally to North Africa. And there's an area in North Africa near the Strait of Gibraltar where Spanish and Arabic crossed over here because there was a lot of interaction between Spanish-speaking and Arabic-speaking cultures. And so there's areas of North Africa where people speak both Spanish and Arabic, particularly in Morocco. That's also where Spinosaurus is from, if you're a big Spinosaurus fan. Anyway, some Spinosaurus materials from Morocco. Some of it's from Egypt. But Point is, there's a lot of Spanish speaking in North Africa. And so I think that Rey Dao was probably, or at least I hope it was, named with that fusion of Spanish and Arabic in mind, because what better for a ruler of these two very distinct and very interesting cultures? What better to kind of rule their land than a ruler with a name that is readable in both languages? It is the King of Light, um, in both of those, in like by fusing both those languages together, which I think is cool. So now let's get into the anatomy, and this is when I'm going to start hurling terms at you. First, we're going to talk about the skeletal anatomy. I wanted to kind of build this animal from the inside out to give the most complete perspective of it. So the skeleton is broken into two parts. You have the axial skeleton, which I'll draw it here. This is your axial skeleton. There we go. And then there's your little tailbone down there. This is what your axial skeleton looks like if you're a person. It's your skull, your ribs, and then your, not necessarily your pelvis, that's part of your pelvic girdle, and then your tailbone. And then you have your appendicular skeleton, which is your arms and your legs and the associated attachments. So Rey Dau's axial skeleton, which is unfortunately the only part that we can really see with part breaks, is pretty noteworthy. It's got two major adaptations. One, Rey Dau's whole manner of walking and moving is adapted to support the use and firing of its electrical organ, and it's got those giant horns on its head that are going to weigh it down, which is a challenge for bipedal movement. And so we're going to discuss that in just a little bit. So this is an image of what we would call physical tomography. It's science for cutting something down the middle. A physical tomography is really, really useful if you're looking at things like muscles or tissues or fossils, and you just really want to get a look inside. So this is an example of physical tomography of Rey Dau's tail. This whole situation, this big bone that's sitting in the middle, this is called a caudal vertebra. One of them is a vertebra, multiple are vertebrae. That's something that a lot of people mix up. The words are very similar, and sometimes it can be hard to distinguish between them, but multiple are vertebrae, one is a vertebra. Now, this caudal vertebra is super, super important. It acts as basically an anchoring point for every single structure that goes on around in this tail. It protects very important blood vessels, it protects the spinal cord, and it connects to the next caudal vertebra to allow for a long and stiff tail to be held out behind the body. The caudal vertebra is very, very important for a lot of animals. For us humans, it's not particularly important because we don't really have any true caudal vertebrae anymore. We just have our fused little coccyx, which is attached to the bottom of our hips. And those fused vertebrae do serve an important purpose. They're a good muscle attachment point, but nothing like the caudal vertebrae of some other animals that are, in many cases, one of the main places they attach their muscles to get around. So now we know what that stuff on the inside of the tail is called. This is all caudal vertebra, all this bone here. But the stuff around the outside, all that stuff that's not muscle or this white area down there, that's called integument. That's part of the integumentary system. So the integument is all that stuff that sits on top of or in the skin or the skin itself. That's things like scales, feathers, fur, or that weird stuff from Yishan, that iguanodontid that was just discovered named Haolung Dongai, which is a dinosaur that has neither, it's got spines on it that aren't scales, they're not feathers, they're not fur, they're some other thing, which is extraordinarily fascinating. But I hate dinosaurs with a burning passion, so it doesn't interest me. I'm kidding. I love dinosaurs. I think they're beautiful and amazing. I would never dog on dinosaurs. I think they're awesome. I just have a personal preference for crocodilians. Anyway, so this is all part of the integumentary system. Rey Dau's scales are actually really interesting. In the game, you're implied to be able to know how old a Rey Dau is by looking at how smooth its scales are. And what that indicates to me is that these scales grow really, really rapidly when the animal is young, and then they peter out a little bit. Kind of similar to what we would expect to see with, say, elephant tusks. Now, it's not the exact same situation. Elephant tusks grow from the base and not the tip, so by looking at how smoothed out the bottom of the tip is, you can kind of get an estimate, but Elephant tusks are hard to age because they're constantly growing and they're also constantly wearing down. But generally, you can tell an old tusk from a new one by looking at the way that they're worn. Mammoth tusks especially tend to develop these big flat patches on them because mammoths use their tusks to dig and root through the ground a lot. And so mammoth tusks, you can tell that they've been worn down. Something similar seems to be happening with these scales. And they don't seem to be replaced very often, if at all, which is interesting. Most animals shed their skin. What that would indicate to me is that Rey Dau is putting a lot of resources into these scales. Perhaps they're made up of a different construction of the scales of animals that we see today, and they're just not compatible with replacement. Or maybe some other thing is happening. They could be growing from the inside out and kind of depositing outward, which is why the outside seems to be getting smoother as new layers are constantly coming up from the inside, which is interesting. There's a couple things that grow like that. I know the screamers, which are kind of duck, they have spines on their wings that grow in that fashion. I'm probably missing some super obvious example, but it's late. I can't think of one right now. But yeah, so that's the integumentary system. Those are Rey Dau's scales. They don't have a ton to do with its functional morphology besides that whole thing they do where they trap fulgurite, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So next we have our first muscles. So this big muscle on top, this is called the longissimus caudae. And this is a big muscle that attaches to the transverse process, which I'll get into there, and then that top part of the vertebra. And this is going to pull the tail to the side and upwards. We call that pulling laterally and vertically. So for example, if I contracted just this muscle on this side, it would pull the tail that way. If I contracted both of these, the tail would bend straight up. And if I contracted one of these big muscles and one of these big muscles, it would pull the tail to the side. So yeah, that's our longissimus caudae, big strong muscle. It's going to round out the tail, give it a nice shape. It's going to make it very dense, which is important if you're using your tail as a counterweight. We'll get into why that's important later. And it's going to, give the tail a lot of strength rather than keeping it all skinny like a whip. So next up we have the two caudofemoralis longus muscles. These are functionally the same. Plus one extra thing. The longissimus caudae attaches just to the spine along the top here. The caudofemoralis actually attaches, like the name suggests, caudo meaning tail, femoralis, femur, is going to attach to the femur. So this is actually going to pull and grab onto basically a foothold on the femur. We'll talk about that in a second. But so not only is this muscle going to affect the way that the tail moves, it's actually going to assist with walking as well. Assuming this muscle works the same way that it does in other, assuming Rey Dau's an archosaur and it has a caudofemoralis, but it's got very archosaurian tail anatomy, so that's what I'm basing this off of. And so it's got these big muscles on the side, these caudofemoralis muscles. These are also going to be doing the same job as the other tail muscles that we went over, the longissimus caudae, and they're going to pull down and to the side, or if just one is contracted, they're going to pull like that. And so what's really, really interesting about Rey Dau's tail is that it has relatively few muscles, which is something that we'll talk about. I'm teasing a lot of discussions, but I promise these are all going to wrap around and things will start making sense very soon. Just going over some of the basic anatomical terms so that everybody's on the same page about this sort of thing. So when I mentioned that I was assuming Rey Dau was an archosaur and it had a caudofemoralis, that's because archosaurs, which are the group of reptiles that today includes birds and crocodilians, those are the only two living groups of archosaurs, but they were incredibly diverse in the past. For the last 252 million years, archosaurs have been the most successful animals with a backbone on the planet. Really, there's, as far as I'm aware, no other single vertebrate group that is comparatively recent and also as successful as archosaurs. Fish have been around for a very long time. Fish also are not real, so I'm not going to count them. But we have, six or so thousand species of mammals, quite a few species of lizards and snakes. Archosaurs, there are almost 10,000 species. Birds, I'll admit, are pulling most of that weight, but give it a kick to the crocodilians too. They've been doing a lot, and there are, compared to the 10,000 species of birds, there's about 26 species of crocodilians. So Clearly, one of those categories is contributing more towards the Archosaur success story than the other, but only one of those categories has sick-ass bony armor and a pulmonary shunt that allows it to recirculate the oxygenated blood back around its body. Crocodiles are the coolest animals ever to live. Speaking of crocodiles and crocodilians, this on the bottom right is an alligator tail. You can see the cauda femoralis here is massive compared to Rey Dau. That's because the cauda femoralis is really in charge of this side-to-side motion in the archosaur tail. It's often much, much bigger than the muscles that are going to sit on the top here. And so it's kind of interesting to see that Rey Dau doesn't have a very large cauda femoralis, which is kind of to be expected for reasons that we'll get into in a second. But Tyrannosaurus also has a really big one. It's a really powerful bipedal predator. And the cauda femoralis on Tyrannosaurus's tails is going to be huge as well. And you can see it's anchoring to this point on the femur. Let me get a different color. It's anchoring to this point on the femur. This is called the fourth trochanter. It's one of the ways that we figure out what a dinosaur femur is compared to some other reptile femur. And that's because in dinosaurs, the fourth trochanter is kind of blade-like. Let me do my interpretive drawing here. This is what a dinosaur femur is going to look like. You see this fourth trochanter sticking out right here, and it's asymmetrical. In a lot of other archosaurs, the femur is going to look like that. The fourth trochanter is going to stick out of the side like that. Dinosaurs, it's asymmetrical. That's because dinosaurs are doing a lot of really, really powerful walking, and so they have this very specialized fourth trochanter attachment point. And Rey Dau probably has something similar. It's a powerful biped. However, not necessarily. It's definitely got a fourth trochanter pulling that cauda femoralis, because otherwise it would have nowhere to attach it. But it might not have one as large and specialized as the dinosaurs. I say that because not all big, powerful bipedal archosaurs did. There were some other groups of archosaurs that did walk on two legs that didn't have that sort of femur construction. So with that being said, we can't say much about what Rey Dau's femur looks like just from its tail muscles, other than the fact that it has this attachment point. It's a powerful biped, and some of that bipedal walking is involving the muscles of the tail rather than just the muscles of the hip like you would see in humans, for example. So next up, we have a real elephant in the room. That's these big white patches down here. Now, let's do a little engagement exercise. I want everybody to think about what these could possibly be. We know that Rey Dau is a big predator. We know that it has some very, very specialized adaptations for a variety of different things. It's a big flying predator. Maybe these structures are supporting its flight. Maybe they're supporting its unique way of capturing prey. Maybe they're fat storage. There's a lot of things that these could be, but they're definitely not regular skeletal muscle. So think about that for just a second. I'm going to tell you now what they are. Feel free to comment your answer, what you think these might be. I'm sure probably quite a few people got it right, because when you cut the tail and you see Rey Dau do a discharge, they actually glow, and that's because these are the main electric organs. Now I'm calling these the main electric organs, main in quotes. The electric organs of the electric eel are divided into three names. We have the main electric organs. Those are the ones that send out really, really high voltage discharges. Then we have the sax electric organ, which does medium pulses, and then the hunter's organ, the sax organ does low pulses, the hunter's organ does medium pulses. And so these organs all have very different purposes. Rey Dau seems to have the same suite, or at least two of those, probably three. Because it seems to electrolocate to some degree. So Rey Dau probably has the same functional three electric organs of an electric eel. I'm not saying that Rey Dau is evolved from electric eels and literally shares those same electric organs, but for the sake of being clear, I'm going to refer to Rey Dau's organs as the main sax and hunter's organs. These are the main organs. They're the biggest ones. They're responsible for generating the largest pulse, and they start all the way back up here in the tail, and they run all the way down the body, and they end up right at those horns over there. So these are the main electric organs. They're quite a doozy when it comes to their physiology. Electric organs are really, really bizarre. After we finish with the full internal anatomy segment and talk about the rest of Rey Dau's body, I'm going to get back into this, but we're going to just do a quick overview of what these electric organs are. Electric organs in gymnotiforms, which are the group of animals, including electric eels, that I'm basing my comparison off of. They develop very early in the animal's life, really just after hatching. They are fully developed almost. Their origin is quite debated. Some people say that they're skeletal muscle that gets modified into electric organs. Some people say that something else entirely is happening. They develop really, really fast. And some people are like, well, if they're modified skeletal muscle, they should develop after the skeletal muscle's already there. Some people are like, no, that's a dumb idea. That's one of the more polite things I've ever heard a scientist say to another scientist. We like to fight a lot. I joke. There's plenty of very cordial people in this field, but a lot of them are not so calm with their words. Anyway, I'm glad I've never had to discuss electric eels because they seem like a total nightmare. But these electric organs, they contain cells called electrocytes. And these electrocytes have two faces. So there's one that has a nerve cell sticking into it, and the other one doesn't. And so basically what happens is when this electrocyte receives this nerve signal, it's going to let all this sodium flow into it, and it's going to take up ATP, which is like cell fuel. The cells are consuming a lot of energy, chemical energy from the body to transfer that into electrical energy, which is really just how your nerves work. They're sending a small electrical signal from place to place. These cells are sending a very, very big electrical signal for a very short period of time. And that gets amplified when there's a bunch of electrocytes all stacked on top of each other like a Pringles can, which is how they're organized. When a synchronized signal is given to all of them, it can produce a huge shock. In electric eels, that shock can kill a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it does. That shock mainly serves to actually just immobilize that prey or paralyze it so that the electric eel can gulp it down. But these electric organs are not just for hunting. They can do so many different things. They are obviously useful for what's called remote control of prey items. These animals will control the muscle movements of prey items from very far away, which can make hunting exceptionally easy because guess how easy it is to grab something that is shaking and seizing when it's trying to hide underwater. Most underwater animals hunt by feeling changes in pressure in conjunction with their sight, smell, and all that stuff. So tracking down something that's constantly shaking and swimming around in circles because it's receiving electrical stimulation to its muscles is less difficult. These also function as a really, really powerful sensory organ in conjunction with the lateral line system of a lot of fish. So these fish can sense electricity. Electrical organs can put out a pulse that these fish can feel, so they can kind of sense the difference in conductivity from one place to another and see the environment around them, even if they're in total darkness or the water's super murky. They can also use these electric organs to communicate with other electric fish by sending out very, low voltage pulses to transmit information. And last but not least, these electric organs regulate each other. Some electric organs just serve the purpose of making the other electric organs easier to use, preventing damage to the body tissues from those organs' electric discharge, and that kind of thing. So these electric organs are incredibly useful. There's a million different reasons to evolve them. Our goal here is going to be to propose some hypotheses for why Rey Dau might have them. Okay. I was just taking a break from recording, and I saw a paper, and I'm not sure how much this is going to have to do with Rey Dau, because I was just skimming this paper for like 2 minutes, and I haven't gotten the chance to fully read it. But this is an interesting opportunity for me to do more research on this. I really want to get this video out, so I'm probably going to at least have to talk about this more in a follow-up. But these scales of Rey Dau are super rugose, and what the rugosity is like roughness. And that rugosity looks a lot like the kind of bumps and ridges that we see on the ears of bats. And what this paper was saying is that bat ears are so bumpy because as air is moving over those bat ears, rather than kind of catching that air efficiently and acting like a giant parachute, those bumps and ridges turn that air into little tiny vortices that spiral off and don't really interact with each other, rather than one big vortex that ear is going to generate. And Rey Dau's wings do something very similar to that, which I'm going to talk about for sure. But these scales might be serving the same feature. That might be why it's got all these kind of knobs sticking off the side here, is to prevent turbulence, which is important if you're going to be flying in a thunderstorm. Anyway, with that little note out of the way, let's talk about the transverse process. So these things stick right off the side of the centrum of the caudal vertebra. We'll talk about the centrum in a second. But they're going to serve to give the vertebra strength and structure and act as a muscle attachment point for a lot of these muscles that are surrounding the vertebra. And they're basically what gives the tail its width. The wider the centra, the wider the tail is going to be overall. You'll see that is true with all these kind of four projections that are sticking out of the side of the vertebra, is that they're going to dictate the overall shape of the tail. Now, is this always true? Yes and no. The anatomy of these structures does indicate the width of the tail pretty reliably, but not just their actual like side to side width. For example, beavers actually have quite short transverse processes, but their structure indicates that there's a pretty substantial soft tissue attachment to them. So beaver tails, we know, are pretty wide, and we can tell that, we would be able to tell that from looking at the vertebrae, because there's these very large attachment points on the side. However, without knowing exactly how far away that soft tissue would go, we wouldn't necessarily be able to say reliably. But the transverse processes do inform the width of the tail in two ways, by just basically forcing it to be as wide as they are, because you don't want your bones sticking out of your body, unless you're a deer, in which case that's kind of the whole goal of your life. But they also inform the width of the tail via the soft tissue that's attached to the outside of them here. Now, Rey Dau doesn't have a ton of that going on. The scales are mostly attached to the skin. They're not attached directly to the vertebra, but that's a function that the transverse processes have. We have this big structure on top of the vertebra. This is a very, very cool and important structure. It's called the neural spine. If you've ever seen Spinosaurus, that big dinosaur with a sail on its back, the neural spine is what gives those sails their shape. That's why Spinosaurus was named initially. It means high-spined lizard, it means spined lizard. The high-spined lizard is Acrocanthosaurus, which actually has shorter neural spines. There's also Tenosauruscus, which is an archosaur with big neural spines, Arizonosaurus, Dimetrodon. All these guys have really, really tall neural spines that stick over the top of their vertebrae and attach various structures to them. The same thing is true of bison. Bison have big neural spines to attach ligaments to keep their head off the ground when grazing. These neural spines are incredibly diverse in their functions and their shapes and their sizes. In Rey Dau, they're fairly simple. They're a bit tall, but that's mainly just to give basically an attachment point for these big muscles that are sticking off the side to give form to the tail. And they're also going to be protecting in the middle here. That's a bad color to use. What if I just use white? There we go. They're going to be protecting in there the actual nerve cord, the nerves that are running down the tail. They're going to be trapped inside that little pocket inside the neural spine. So if you're actually looking at one, the centrum of the vertebra is going to be down there, right there, and then the neural spine is going to stick up like that in this little pocket there. That's where the nerves are all going to flow through. And this wasn't always the case. The earliest chordates, the earliest animals that kind of resemble vertebrates, just have kind of a backbone, almost, not quite. It's called a notochord, and then their nerves are just running along the top of it without any bony protection. That's probably because they didn't have bones in the first place, but the point is, it takes a while for the hard tissue to really actually wrap around and protect those nerves, and that's really important when you're an animal as large as Rey Dau that's living a life as rough as it. So if you ever get an injury to your back and you don't end up paralyzed for life, give a big thank you to your ancestors for evolving those neural spines to protect your very, very precious spinal cord. It's important stuff. Then kind of mirroring the neural spines on the bottom of the vertebrae are these structures. These are called chevrons or hemal spines. And where the neural spines are protecting the spinal cord, the chevrons are wrapping around and protecting important blood vessels. And in the very early vertebrae, they're wrapping around and protecting the reproductive system and the urinary tract. In some animals, those empty out the same hole, and some they go to different ones. Most animals have cloacas, which is just, not most animals. Most land vertebrates have cloacas, which is just one hole that dumps everything out. And then a few have separate holes if you're lucky. But yeah, so here's the chevron. It's going to be wrapping around a whole variety of different things. In Rey Dau, the chevrons kind of group together into this structure that sticks down on the bottom. In some animals that doesn't happen. They kind of just stick out to the side like that. I think vipers don't have fused chevrons, but the morphology of these is super diverse and a pretty accurate way of actually categorizing different groups of animals if you're just looking at the backbones is looking at how the chevrons are structured. For example, if you're looking at a bunch of snake fossils and you want to know vaguely what family the snake is from, vipers have very distinct chevrons. I got a friend who's really, really good at identifying viper vertebrae. Her name is Ashley Gibson. If you're watching this, shout out Ashley Gibson. Anyway, I don't know, I just full named Ashley Gibson on my YouTube channel. Everybody go follow Ashley Gibson. She's great. She's a zoo archaeologist. So these chevrons are really, really cool. They're great structural support for all these very important soft things, and they also provide muscle attachment points for these muscles on the bottom of the vertebrae. You'll notice that a lot of these bony structures serve a ton of different functions, which is why I'm spending so much time on them, and at the same time kind of glossing over a lot of the details about them, because I could, sit and probably talk for 10 hours just about chevrons on their own, but we have a whole animal to talk to, and so I'm going to give these chevrons exactly 2 minutes and 3 seconds, give or take some Ashley Gibson shoutouts, and then we're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to get to probably the most important part of the vertebra, which is this part right here. This is called the centrum. Now, you can probably guess what the centrum is just from the name. It sits in the center of the vertebra, and it serves as an attachment point for everything that sticks off of it, from muscles to other portions of the vertebra, to all the tissues that wrap up the spinal cord. It's just very important. It is also the part of the vertebra that articulates with the next one. So the two centra of each vertebra will be in contact with each other like that, with a little bit of a disc in the middle. One weird side note about these discs is the way that vertebrae attach to each other is actually pretty flexible throughout a lot of different species. We get a lot of different styles of attachment, a lot of different kinds of intervertebral joints. For example, mammals actually have these little bony discs that sit between the vertebrae sometimes. Those are called intervertebral discs. Alligators and crocodiles, they have these kind of fluid pocket joints in the middle. Mammals do as well with synovial fluid. Alligators don't have, true synovial joints. They have something else. But there's a lot of different ways in which these structures articulate to one another. They're incredibly diverse, and what that can do is it can give us an idea of what group an animal belongs to just by looking at its vertebrae. It can't necessarily tell you a lot about what the animal looks like, but if you ever see those images in the news of like, oh, scientists discover a new dinosaur, it belongs to XY group, and then you look it up and it's like, well, how did they figure that out if they only found parts of the backbone? I can tell you, you can learn a heck of a lot about where an animal's going to sit in a family tree based on just the backbone, because of all these different unique strategies that these animals are employing with the way that they develop their bodies. From snakes to lizards to dinosaurs, there are all these different groups of these animals are doing very different things with their vertebrae, and so you can get a pretty good sense of where they are. And I imagine the same thing would probably be true to wyverns too, because every single wyvern I've cut the tail off of has had a really, really different structured vertebra. Not necessarily enough for me to understand where the broader trends are going, because they're all so different from one another. The world of monster hunters seems like it's quite recently recovering from a mass extinction. There is not necessarily a lack of biodiversity, but a lot of these animals are incredibly different from one another, which suggests that the intermediate forms have been extirpated. They've gone extinct, or at the very least they're quite inaccessible in the ways that we can access these large monsters. It could just be the fact that all of the related animals are too small to cut the tails off of, and so we can't observe those anatomical similarities. But yeah, that's the centrum. It's the part of the vertebra that attaches to the next vertebra. We're going to get to the spinal cord. Now, this part is not made of bone, but it's very, very important to what a vertebra does and what the whole vertebral column is trying to accomplish. Really, one of the main functions of the backbones are providing support and protection to this spinal cord. It is incredibly fragile, incredibly sensitive, and incredibly important. Its job is to transmit electrical signals throughout the body, which for most of us means that is what allows us to move. For Rey Dau, it allows us to move, and it also allows Rey Dau, I say that as if I'm a Rey Dau, it allows Rey Dau to move, and it also allows the discharge of these electrical organs. So having a well-protected spinal cord is exceptionally important, because who knows, a caudal spinal injury to Rey Dau for a Rathalos might mean that it just can't move the back part of its tail. For a Rey Dau, that might mean it compromises the function of a good chunk of its electric organ. So that can explain another explanation, I suppose, behind all this elaborate armor on the tail, is that it's trying to protect from injury to the tail itself. If Rey Dau loses a chunk of its tail, there's no telling how that spinal cord is going to heal and whether or not it's going to still be able to facilitate discharge of the electrical organ in the rear parts of the tail. With that being said, the spinal cord also does a whole bunch of other things, and one really interesting thing about vertebrates, in comparison to a lot of other groups of animals, is that we have our spinal cord and our nervous system on top of our body, whereas other organisms, many other organisms like insects, and I believe mollusks, crustaceans, they have their spinal cord ventral, which is just an interesting thing that I wanted to point out. I believe it's the separation caused by being a protostome versus a deuterostome, but don't quote me on that. There are two major groups of animals. Two major groups of animals with body cavities. There's a lot of animals that don't really have a defined body cavity area, like a sponge. But there's protostomes. Protostomes means first opening. In protostomes, the first opening of the animal's body that forms during development, like when it's inside the egg, it's a little baby, still not developed at all yet. It's just a clump of cells. And then when that first hole forms, in protostomes, that hole becomes the mouth. In deuterostomes, that hole becomes the butt. We are deuterostomes, so our first opening is the anus, and our second opening is the mouth, which is why we're called deuterostomes, means second hole, second mouth. Yeah, so Rey Dau is a deuterostome. We knew that because it has a backbone, and all animals that have backbones are deuterostomes, but I just wanted to point that out. It's a cool biology fact. So thank you, everyone who managed to sit through almost 40 minutes of me talking about the tale of a fictional video game creature. But if you did make it through, then congratulations. I'm very proud of you, and thank you for supporting my channel very much. I sincerely appreciate everyone who endorses these ramblings. What does this all mean? Our quick summary is that Rey Dau has a lot of muscle on its tail. It's not skinny. It's far from a weenie-looking animal. It's got a big, dense tail full of muscle, and those muscles are attaching primarily to the back and the legs. Now, here's the thing, is that the type of muscles is really reduced. There's only two kinds of muscles. If you look at Lagiacris, it's got all these different muscle differentiations happening on its tail, and that's because Lagiacris's tail is doing a whole range of very precise, very specific movements. It's doing corkscrew motions, it's twisting and pulling. Rey Dau's tail, in comparison, while it's strong, is not going to be as flexible. Not nearly. And we see something quite similar in dinosaur tails, but even in dinosaur tails, they still have quite a few muscle attachments going on, and they generally seem to have actually more diverse muscle groups than Rey Dau. So Rey Dau is going to have an extraordinarily stiff tail. Most of the motion from that tail is going to be probably dictated by the muscles attaching at the base. We're going to get to a really good example of that in just a second. It's basically acting as a pillar of balance for the animal. This is going to allow it to be comfortable walking around on two legs without touching its wings to the ground, while still carrying around that gigantic heavy skull. If you've ever seen a crane carrying a big load, on the back of that crane there's going to be a giant box of counterweight, and that's going to prevent the crane from tipping over forward. Rey Dau is always carrying a big weight around because its skull is super large and dense, and it has a relatively short neck. It can't do what a bird does and basically fold its head over its body so that it can still develop a large head above the center of gravity. What Rey Dau is going to have to do, because it wants to hold its neck in front of it, is just push its center of gravity back by basically moving a weight farther behind it. The closer this weight moves to the body, the farther forward the center of gravity is going to go. So Rey Dau is going to have a tail long enough to move the center of gravity over the legs and walk comfortably. So now we're going to go to probably my favorite functional morphology experiment of all time, or definitely at least a top 10. And that's this project that was done, I'm not sure the institution, but basically what they did was they took a chicken and they attached a plunger onto its pygostyle, which is the short reduced tail in birds. And basically what they did was they extended the center of gravity backward. Surprise, surprise, that made the bird tilt forward and start carrying its head more in the front. What other group of organisms does that besides birds? Pretty much all the other theropod dinosaurs. So this bird just instinctively, to correct its posture, assumed a very theropod dinosaur-like stance. Well, birds are a kind of theropod dinosaur, but they're very specialized, and they tend to carry their head far above their body. But you can see here, this bird is now compensating for that weight by leaning forward, which is exactly what Rey Dau is doing here. So you can see Rey Dau is leaning all the way forward so it can compensate for having that big weight on its back end. Its tail widens toward the end. It's really concentrating the mass all the way back there. And now, why is that important? Well, it's super important because it really allows Rey Dao to discharge electricity in the way it does. It can hold its head straight out in the front. And because the head is straight out in the front, that means that when it discharges that electricity, and in the game it gets a substantial amount of recoil from this, not sure if that's because of some chemical reaction or what, or if it's just its muscles contracting, but the head is going to be forced backward. Now, if you're holding your head above your body like that, and Rey Dao was looking like this and discharging electricity, its head would snap backward and it would break its own neck. But if Rey Dao is holding its head straight out in front of its body, then all of its backbones, all of its vertebrae are standing right there in parallel, ready to just absorb that impact directly, and it's bracing itself with its arms. Because its chest is closer to the ground, it also has to modify its wings less to enable quadrupedality. Pterosaurs need to have very, very complex wings to actually be able to walk on the ground properly, and they need super, super long, lanky legs. Rey Dao can't afford that. Its body is nice and close to the ground. It's going to be very, very able to just drop its wings down and walk comfortably. Additionally, the head can be proportionally larger. That's just a nice bonus of being able to have a shorter neck, is that you can put more mass into your head. We see this in tyrannosaurs. They have a very short neck, very short front limbs, because they are making the most of the amount of mass they can put in the front of their body by pouring it all into the skull. Rey Dao is doing something very, very similar. It obviously has the caveat of also having wings, so it can't put all of its mass into its skull, but if Rey Dao wasn't flying, it probably would have a much larger head. So now let's get to the legs and feet, my favorite part of the animal. In Rey Dao, not necessarily, but generally I think foot morphology is pretty interesting. Anyway, Rey Dao's feet have what we would call an anisodactyl morphology. Anisodactyly is something that we see in birds mostly, where you have digits 2, 3, and 4 pointing forward and digit 1 pointing backward. That would be like your big toe pointing backward and all your other toes pointing forward. Now, in birds, positions of the foot other than anisodactyly, so things like parrots where you have 2 toes pointing forward and 2 pointing backward, those are strongly associated with good long parental care periods. And that's because when these birds are young, they come out by default with an anisodactyl pattern. That's kind of the ancestral condition of birds. And it seems to be a similar deal with wyverns as well. That's a pretty common foot pattern, and so we can safely assume that that's probably the, or at least close to the default pattern of the group. It's what we would call the ancestral condition. Now, obviously, we don't have as perfect data for this because we can't get into their DNA like we can with birds, but in wyverns, it seems to be something similar of having one toe pointing backward and the rest pointing forward. When we look at birds that have this non-anisodactyl foot pattern of multiple toes pointing in different directions rather than the default, it turns out that the way that they accomplish that is first by having very long parental care periods where the offspring are hatched early and taken care of for an extended period of time without moving, where they actually just cannot walk around but they're out of the egg. Because they don't have to walk as early and they're seeing such intense parental care, they can take longer to develop their feet. And because the development of non-anisodactyl feet, which are not the default arrangement, takes longer, it takes a longer time because those foot bones can't come out of the egg solid. They have to come out soft and pliable as cartilage, and then they turn into bone later as the bird ages. That can only happen in animals that don't have to fend for themselves immediately. This doesn't mean that Rey Dao isn't taking care of its offspring. A lot of anisodactyl birds do have good parental care, but it means that we can't say either way whether or not Rey Dao is a good parent. This is an example of what we would call a knowledge gap. This is not something that we can really answer from what's in the game as far as I'm aware. Nothing about Rey Dao's biology really gives us a clue how well or how poorly it's taking care of its offspring, what its reproductive strategy is like. It's a very difficult species to analyze. And this is not uncommon in science at all. There are some taxa that we just have a terrible time researching. Tomistoma schlegeli is a species of crocodilian that's never been bred in captivity. It's extraordinarily mysterious. It preys on all manner of things, and for a long time, no one even really knew what it was, because its genetic data and its morphological data put it in completely different parts of the crocodilian family tree. Fortunately, some further study has pretty squarely put it next to gharials, which is very interesting because its common name is the false gharial. It was assumed to be a crocodile that simply evolved into a gharial-like form over time, but that doesn't seem to be the case because it looks like it's more closely related to the true gharials than anything else. But Tomastoma is very similar to Rey Dau in this aspect because we just don't know a ton about how they breed. We have to rely on what we know about their relatives. If Rey Dau was anything like its relatives, then it could be like Rathalos, which, mate and take care of their offspring. Seregios is also a flying wyvern that we know takes good care of its young. But then again, it could be completely different from its relatives. There are birds like Jasanas that take care of their offspring in a completely different way to most other birds that you wouldn't predict based on their genetic data. If all Jasanas went extinct, we would have no idea that the big, strong Jasanas that are developing these crazy weapons to fight over mates are actually the females, and the males are the small, gracile ones that are taking care of the offspring. That's just not something we'd be able to predict, and it's very much the case. So, Rey Dau, for now, the way it breeds, the way it reproduces, and the way that it takes care of its young, that's a big mystery. So anisodactyly is what we call a morphotype, which is a kind of morphology. Morphology is just a fancy science way of saying the shape of an animal or the shape of a part of an animal. It just really means shape. You can say cows and sheep have different horn morphologies because their horns are different shapes. Crocodilians and birds have very different limb morphologies because their limbs are different shapes and they move in different ways. Predatory birds basically all have this morphology. There are some pretty notable exceptions. For example, down here we have an assemblage of predatory birds. On the left we have what's called a typical anisodactyl morphotype. Here we have this like osprey foot, which is doing some weird stuff. It's starting to splay out a lot. It's very flexible. They're fish catchers. Then we have owls. God knows what owls are doing with their feet. They have this sort of situation going on where their feet look a lot like parrots. And then we have what we call the raptorial morphotype. There's another one that's not here, which I think is actually really cool, and that's what we see in Seriemas, which are another group of predatory birds. Actually, I don't think Seriemas have a toe claw touching the ground. Theirs is off the ground, so it's not actually bearing weight. But they have three toes touching the ground, and then they have one really, really short toe, and this short toe has attached to it a giant claw that sits off the ground like a velociraptor, it's just pretty cool. It's not relevant to this conversation. I just wanted to share that cool fact about Seriemas. They're very closely related to terror birds, if you know what those are. They're extinct giant ice age predators. Anyway, so this raptorial morphotype is really, really interesting compared to what we see in the typical anisodactyl morphotype. It's more flexible. The toes can splay out and pull in easier. And it also has a giant big toe. That in birds is called the hallux. It's opposed. It's facing away from the rest of the toes. And you can see Rey Dau also has it. Its hallux is gigantic. It's proportionally much, much larger than it would be otherwise. And that's because in these predatory birds, that big hallux serves a pretty important purpose. So the hallux serves to manipulate objects, including prey items, and to initially capture those prey items and sometimes to dispatch them. So big halluxes are found in a lot of predatory birds that are particularly grabbing things like small mammals, even big mammals. On the left here you have a harpy eagle, which is a predatory bird that often takes relatively large mammal prey. And you can see it has this giant hallux, which is going to help it grip and grab very, very well. The most flexible digits are typically found in things that are grabbing very small and slippery animals. Rey Dau has a fairly flexible foot, obviously not like an owl or an osprey, so we can see that it's probably taking quite medium-sized prey, which makes sense when we get into why it's hunting. It's not going to be very good at picking out very small prey items. Omnivores, in general, have pretty limited flexibility of the feet. They're not going after as much moving prey, and so gripping with that hallux really doesn't matter a lot to them. So the hallux, once you grab onto a prey item, is going to function in a few different ways. In Rey Dau, the hallux seems to function as a killing claw. Note, I say it's similar to the killing claw of dromaeosaurs, which are the dinosaurs that a lot of people call raptors. It's similar in that it helps with gripping. The killing claw of dromaeosaurs probably wasn't actually for killing so much as their mouth was. Dromaeosaurs have pretty ferocious mouths, and in birds, when we have that raised claw that doesn't touch the ground, and it's that shape with that long curvature and great piercing capability, it's often more for grabbing and holding than inflicting a lot of damage. And that's because that claw is going to be very bad for slashing. Those teeth are great for slashing. They're great at inflicting tissue damage and tearing flesh and all that. And so the dromaeosaurs probably are just going to use their claws to hold on to something while they rip it to shreds with their mouth. Now, what's really interesting about accipitrids, which are a group of predatory birds, they have a gigantic hallux. These are things like hawks and eagles. And in their feet, about half the grip strength alone just comes from the hallux. And what that's going to allow animals like Rey Dau to do is puncture much more efficiently. If you've ever gotten a shot at the doctors, they might give you something called a shot blocker. And what this shot blocker does is it's got a bunch of these little tiny points that are going to poke into you. And it's kind of like a bed of nails, almost. Now, if there were just one of these little hard points, like, say, a big long needle, that would be able to puncture the skin quite effectively. But because there's all a bunch of little ones, also I don't think shot blockers are that sharp, but imagine they are. This would not be able to puncture your skin very effectively, because there's all these different points, and the pressing down from the hand is going to be spread very evenly across all these different points of contact. But if that same amount of force is just applied to one point of contact, and it's not being, bordered by anything else, then suddenly all of that force is going on to just one point, and it's going to be able to puncture a lot more effectively. And so a big curved hallux, far away from all the other toes, that's going to be able to apply a lot more force, is going to be able to get through some really tough stuff, which makes a lot of sense because the animals in Rey Dau's territory are extremely tough. Balahara, Keratinoth, all these guys have some method of preventing, typical amounts of damage to their body. And that makes sense because presumably they're living in an area where predators are going to try and get through their skin. For an animal like Rey Dau, getting through that tough skin means a relatively easy meal afterward. When we're looking at other kinds of predatory birds like owls, we can see that puncturing with the feet doesn't really matter that much to them. In fact, it doesn't matter a lot to a lot of birds because they've got a big mean beak that they can use to tear stuff apart on their own. And so we see that the pressure from their toes is more evenly spread. This is actually not an owl foot, that's a Seregias. And Seregias indeed does have a big mean beak in comparison to Rey Dau, which despite having a gigantic head, actually has a proportionally quite small mouth for its size. That mouth probably isn't going to be able to do much in regards to actually effectively killing a prey item. Indeed, when Rey Dau gets attacked by a hunter, its reflex is not to go bite it. It's going to be doing a lot more with the rest of its body. And so Seregias isn't really preoccupied with dispatching its prey with its claws. If it can grab onto something and hold it, it doesn't really care about getting through it right in that moment with the feet. And so that explains why it has a much more owl or parrot-like foot morphology compared to Rey Dau's, which is going to be punching through anything that it comes across, especially when Rey Dau is diving down on something with feet first and just immediately dropping all of its body weight into it, which is how it hunts. So when it comes to actually dispatching the prey, a lot of raptors will do that by squeezing with the hallux and stopping respiration. They'll press down on a little prey item and just squeeze until it stops breathing. Others just bite. They just start biting it until it stops moving. Rey Dau kind of does both. It does attack with the hallux, but it doesn't seem to do a sustained squeeze. It kind of just comes down on a prey item, crushes it, picks it up, and then flies away. That's pretty effective. It's not a terrible prey killing strategy. Peregrine falcons do something quite similar, where they'll dive down on something and deliver massive force to it very quickly. Sometimes that doesn't kill it, but it will at the very least stun it, and then they can start eating. So yeah, Rey Dau is using its hallux in a kind of bizarrely effective way, I would say, because it's not just using it to grab and hold really effectively by piercing deep into tissue. It's using that hallux to actually
grab specific tissue that's going to cause damage to the prey, because its mouth isn't that effective at tearing and ripping its very well-armored compatriots, or contemporaries. I wouldn't call them compatriots because they're getting eaten. So, why does Rey Dao pick up the prey anyway? If it's so effective at just killing something wherever it wants to, why isn't it just sitting down in the middle of that Karatnoth herd in the storm and eating right there? Rey Dao basically always carries prey items away. It happens 9 out of 10 times. I've maybe seen Rey Dao eat something where it finds it once ever. And Rey Dao really, really reliably will grab stuff, carry it away, and eat somewhere else. That's really costly. That's just, if you were in a zoo and you were doing that in a controlled environment, you would be very, very irresponsibly just increasing the amount of nutrition that you're losing with prey capture. This is kind of a numbers game. If you expend more energy getting a prey item than you gain out of eating and digesting it, what are you doing with your life? Like, that's just a recipe for disaster. No animal that consistently does that is going to be able to survive. And this is why ambush predators are so common and so effective. Would a crocodile probably get more prey if it was constantly repositioning to new optimal spots and chasing stuff around in the water? Maybe. But does it need to? No, because by sitting in one spot, it's negating the need to get that much more prey. So nutrient efficiency is super important. You want to expend as little energy as possible when you're eating. So why is Rey Dao expending this extra energy to move prey away from the killing site? Well, prey guarding behavior is actually extremely common in predators. And that's because when you kill something, that's the hard part. If a prey item is dead, it cannot run away, and all you have to worry about as a predator is making it too much of a hard time for other predators to hang around, and then you get a free meal. Hyenas will do this, hyenas will have this done to them quite frequently. Hyenas are extremely successful predators. A lot of people don't know this. They have a great success rate when they hunt, and they're exceptionally well-adapted, active predators that will chase down and hunt prey. They're not primarily scavengers. What does do a lot of scavenging is lions. Lions are big and they're scary, and they travel in pretty large groups. And so if a lion or two come up to a carcass that hyenas have brought down, suddenly it becomes a pretty risky game for the hyenas to get all the nutrients they can out of that carcass. And those lions have basically scored a free meal just by walking over there and showing up. There are a lot of predators in the Windward Plains that are going to be able to do this. I doubt that Rey Dao would consider it worth it to eat a prey item where it's sitting, especially if it's only the size of a Ceratnoth. If it's sitting somewhere and 3 Doshaguma are coming up and harassing it. That's just not a very good strategy, to sit around and get swiped at by 3 bears that are probably about as heavy as you are. The same thing with Chemetris. Now, Chemetris is not a big animal, but it doesn't matter that it's big. It just matters that it's inconveniencing Rey Dao enough to the point where it's like, well, fighting over this thing that's maybe an eighth of my body weight that I still need to catch and kill a few of today to feed myself is just not worth it. I'm going to go capture another prey item and do something else. So why not just save the trouble of, instead of sitting there, killing something, eating half of it, and flying away, why don't I just grab it, fly somewhere else with it, and eat the whole thing there? That's a pretty effective strategy. Now, some birds will do this. Others will do something called mantling, where they will, sit around a deceased prey item, and they'll just basically cover it up so that no one knows it's there. Rey Dao is unfortunately not doing this for whatever reason, potentially because everyone knows that when Rey Dao is in the area and it's sitting down somewhere, that's probably because it's trying to kill something. But it's just seems to be a more effective strategy for it to fly away. So here I have all of the things that Rey Dao has to worry about at the killing site. Other Ceratnoths that are probably going to bug it for a little bit. Balahara, Chemetris, these guys will all compete over Ceratnoth with Rey Dao, just by harassing it and trying to kick it out of the area. And then we have Rathian and Seregios, which would be attacking it if it was flying during the daytime, during a clear sky. But they don't show up during the storm very often, because that's a very harsh environment to fly in, and Rey Dao is quite well adapted to it. So Rey Dau has to go from worrying about all these guys, which are hanging out in the storm on the ground, or at least might be in the area, to not really worrying about anything else in the sky and being able to fly wherever it wants. These other animals are going to be pretty grounded, so Rey Dau can go somewhere nice and safe, away from everybody else, and enjoy a meal in peace, which is kind of the dream if you think about it. So now let's start to cover the business end of Rey Dau, that being the skull. This skull is extremely complex, and it has a bunch of areas that move around each other. That process of bones moving around each other in the skull is called cranial kinesis. It happens a lot in animals like snakes and fish. However, in a lot of more specialized vertebrates like crocodilians and mammals, I keep bringing up crocodilians, they're my favorite group of animals ever. So I have a little bit of a bias towards them. But in animals like crocodilians and mammals, the skull is going to be a lot more robust and a little bit less flexible. So in Rey Dau, the flexibility, bizarrely, doesn't really happen around the mouth. The actual skull is pretty robust and the jaws are kind of one solid piece, but these big chunks of material are moving around. Now, I can't say for certain whether or not these are bone. I don't think there's any official images of Rey Dau's skull. If there is, I had a hard time finding them, so I can't really say for certain whether this is true cranial kinesis or if these are more just hard pieces of tissue that are being moved around. That could very well be the case. They could just be tissue wrapped in keratin. For example, like the horn of the horned screamer, there's no bone in there. If that was moved around, it would not be cranial kinesis. It would be something else entirely. However, it's a very interesting adaptation. A lot of the neck and facial muscles are seemingly co-opted for this, and it's a very highly specialized structure. And a lot of the skull is going to have to be very robust and very solidly built to accommodate that. That's why the neck has to be so short, is because, if you have all this dangling stuff hanging off the front of your head, having a long neck is going to mean you have to put a lot more effort into waving that around. By having a very short neck, Rey Dau doesn't have to move its skull that much to get to different angles, if that makes sense. It can have a kind of a short window. If it had a long neck, it would take a lot more effort to move the skull from side to side. The front of the skull is, like I said, very blunt, very robust, very rigid, and we'll get into some of the functional consequences of that in a second. Probably the most important part of an animal when it comes to figuring out its lifestyle is the jaws and teeth. These dictate a lot about the way that any organism brings nutrients into its body, which is really one of the two things that you need to do to ensure that you pass on your genes. You got to eat and you got to breed. If you're not doing those things, if you're not successfully growing and reaching sexual maturity, then you're not going to be able to pass your genes on. And if you reach sexual maturity but you can't pass on your genes effectively, be it because you can't find a mate or for other reasons, your genes are not going to get passed on, and all the beneficial mutations that you might have acquired are going to disappear. So those are important. Teeth and jaws are very, very important when it comes to vertebrates. Rey Dau is actually really, really interesting in terms of monster hunter hypothetical evolution because it has quite a bizarre intermediate condition. In the same way that some of those bizarre Devonian lungfish like Tiktaalik have this weird midpoint between true limbs and paddle-like fins, Rey Dau's skull is a really bizarre midpoint between the beak with teeth inside of it that we see in some monsters like Glavenus and Glavenus and Fatalis and some of these other very common design aspects of Monster Hunter, where we're looking at basically, a beak with teeth sitting inside of it. This is something that shows up a lot. Oh, Lagiacris, that's a great example. It's a very common trait. Rey Dau has a beak, and it has teeth that sit inside of that beak, but it actually has two rows. And what's really interesting is that beak actually starts to encroach on the oral tissue and extraoral tissue surrounding those teeth. And so we're starting to see what looks like a midpoint between one row of teeth with a beak on the outside and two rows of teeth with just lips, which we see in the most basal-looking wyverns like Geratodus and the other Piscine wyverns, where they haven't left the water yet. So this part on the outside of the mouth, that's called the rhamphotheca. We'll talk about that in a second. Ray Dao has a ton of different kinds of teeth in its mouth. They're extraordinarily specialized. They're doing a ton of different things. So we are going to go over all the different structures we can identify in the mouth of Ray Dao and talk about what they mean for the way that it's eating. Ray Dao has an absolutely absurd number of different types of teeth. This is not something unheard of. We see a lot of variety in tooth type and function in early vertebrates like fish, or should I say non-tetrapod fish, because at the end of the day we are all fish, and by we I mean basically every animal with a backbone is a fish, with some exceptions. Everything that walks on land is a fish, but not everything that swims in the water is a fish with a backbone. I think that's kind of interesting. Anyway. Let's go over some of these different kinds of teeth. You have coronoid teeth. Those are attached to the coronoid bone. Dentary teeth attached to the dentary bone. Those are pretty self-explanatory. Maxillary bone attaches to the maxillary teeth. Premaxillary bone holds the premaxillary teeth. Palatine teeth sit on the palate of the mouth, which is a bone, the palatine bone. And then lingual teeth attach to the tongue. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to teeth having lingual and labial sides. Labia means lip. So a labial side of a tooth is going to be the side of the tooth that faces towards the lips. The lingual side of the tooth is the side of the tooth that faces towards the tongue. Think about linguistics. Languages are called tongues. Linguist is lingual means relating to the tongue. So lingual teeth are going to grow out of the tongue. So first, we're actually going to talk about something that's not a tooth. On the outside of the mouth, we have these structures. These are called tomia. And so what Ray Dao has around its mouth is a beak. This is all not tooth, and it's not bone either. It's keratin, and it comprises something called a rhamphotheca. And these tomia are cutting edges of the rhamphotheca. If you think of the blades of scissors that slide past each other, when these tomia contact, they're going to perform a cutting action. But they're not contacting everywhere. This upper tomia is going to slide past these two lower teeth and form a cutting edge, and these tomia on the sides are going to contact each other and do some cutting action, but most of the slicing is going to be done by the teeth. Now, because Ray Dao is a flying animal, and teeth are significantly heavier than the tissue that makes up a beak, keratin, I could see a reasonable explanation for the reduction of these teeth in future generations. If I was tracking Ray Dao evolution, I would be measuring the size of the teeth compared to the amount of the mouth that the tomia is taking up. And if the beak was getting bigger and the teeth were getting smaller, I would say, Eureka, that is my case. These animals are consistently reducing their weight generation after generation to be more energy efficient in flight. But obviously I can't do that because this is Monster Hunter and it's a video game, so there's no way for me to track that, which is a little bit frustrating. Next up, we have the maxillary teeth. Now, these maxillary teeth sit inside of the rhamphotheca on the outside. You can see there's all this bill tissue. The rhamphotheca is basically just a fancy word for bill or beak. And so they're going to sit kind of inside this rhamphotheca, but on the inside there's going to be gum tissue. So they're really seated in one kind of tissue on each side. And the maxillary teeth are attached to the maxillary bone. These are not maxillary teeth back here. We'll talk about them later. And these are not maxillary teeth in the front, just the ones on the side. And they're very large. They are conical. So if I was looking at it from the top, rather than looking like that, like a blade, they're going to look relatively round. Now, they're not perfectly round, but they do have a relative roundness to them. And they're very gently curved. They're not, super curved backward to the back of the mouth like hooks to prevent prey escape. And they're very strong. They're very beefy. They're good for crushing. They don't appear to be super serrated or multicuspid, which means that they're only going to have one point. They're powerful. They're not super sharp. They're not super skinny, but they're going to be good for crushing. And they're probably going to be relatively good for piercing hard stuff as well. They probably wouldn't do that much against pretty soft tissue unless they're sliding against other teeth. A big round tooth like that doesn't have a super sharp tip probably isn't going to punch through flesh all that effectively, but it is going to have an easy time getting through things like the shell of a keratinoth. Now, next up, we have the premaxillary teeth. These are super interesting. They sit right under the hook of the bill, and they are so small compared to the maxillary teeth. Now, why on earth is that? This is actually a trend we see very frequently in a lot of animals. These premaxillary teeth are serving the same function as incisors, kind of. In a lot of meat-eating reptiles, we see really small premaxillary teeth that are also leaving very distinct scratch marks on the bones of prey items. If we look at fossils of prey items in tyrannosaur habitats, we'll notice that there's these really small scratch marks on them that could only be left by premaxillary teeth. And what that's telling us is that these animals are using their premaxillary teeth as pseudo-incisors to kind of scrape tissue off of a carcass. When you're a predator, you need to have adaptations not just for acquiring food, but also processing it and making the most of a given meal. If you can't get all the meat off of a carcass, you need to evolve a strategy that ensures that you are getting the most nutrition out of that carcass that you possibly can. If that means just eating the whole thing whole like a snake and breaking down every single part of it over time, that's one way to do it. Or you can be an efficient eater like a tyrannosaur or a crocodilian, and you can scrape all those little hard-to-reach parts of meat off of the bones before you eat it. On the left here, we have an animal called Carcharodontosaurus. It doesn't have those pseudo-incisors. This is actually something that separates the tyrannosaurs and their relatives from a lot of other dinosaur groups, is that they have these premaxillary teeth. They're not unique to them per se, but they are very interesting, and they're a cool observation that you can see and point out to your friends next time you go see a T-Rex at a museum. And I promise the next time you go to a natural history museum, you will absolutely see a T-Rex. If you get really, really familiar with them, you can start to actually identify the individual T-Rex specimens that get cast and displayed at those museums. I'll give you a hint, 90% of them are this one Tyrannosaurus that was called Stan, who was found in South Dakota. Actually, I think it was South Dakota, it might be Montana. But it's I know it was prepared in South Dakota. But yeah. There's a few really complete T-Rexes that get copied and put up in museums. The original Sioux is in Chicago, and the original Stan was sold to a museum in Abu Dhabi because Stan was acquired by commercial fossil hunters, unfortunately. Next up, we have these really, really peculiar teeth. These are pointing out of the roof of the mouth. And it's hard for me to say exactly what these are. They could be palatine teeth or they could be vomeral teeth. And the reason I can't say is because the name we call these teeth depends entirely on what bone they're attached to, and I can't see what Rey Dau's skull looks like. I can't tell where these bones are fusing. I'm practically assuming that it has these bones in the first place. That's not necessarily true. What these teeth are, though, is they're sticking out of the roof of the mouth and they're going to prevent prey escape. If Rey Dau ever gulps down something that's alive, or if it's just trying to ensure that something gets held onto while it's still eating and doesn't fall back out of its mouth, these sharp recurved teeth are going to help significantly. Also, because its tongue has those teeth on it, it can press its tongue up into the roof of its mouth and start to process that tissue manually by kind of grinding it down. It can be chewing basically with its outside and inside of the mouth at the same time. That's a really cool adaptation that it has. These palatine or vomeral teeth are really, really sharp. They're really recurved. They're super thin, and they're multicuspid. So they're not really caring about piercing through hard stuff super effectively. Rather, they're more oriented towards softer material, like, freshly sliced meat. But they're going to be very, very effective at grabbing on and holding that because of all those little spines. They're great at gripping and tearing and holding. And that's why they're farther inside the mouth compared to the outside. If you had your gripping teeth on the outside and your crushing or piercing teeth on the inside, then what's the point of the gripping teeth if nothing that is, soft and grippable is actually going to make it to them? You want to prepare the stuff mechanically before it enters the mouth, and then once it's softened up, you can grab onto it with those teeth on the inside. Now, personally, I think that the teeth of Rey Dau on the roof of its mouth are probably palatine because there's a separation in the middle. You can see the vomer sits between the two palatine bones. And the palatine bones are kind of distinct. They're sitting on each side. They're right behind the maxilla, kind of like how Rey Dau's are. The vomer And this depends on the group of animals, but it tends to be, in kind of a different position, and the vomer teeth also meet in the middle pretty frequently, at least in fish they do, and in this sphenacodont they do as well. However, at the end of the day, there's really no precise way to tell, which is unfortunate, but I'm going to refer to them as palatine teeth because they have that distinct break in the middle, and they don't converge upon themselves like vomerine teeth often do.
Now let's start talking about some structures that are in or around the tongue. So we have these. These I'm going to refer to as lingual teeth. I can't know for sure whether or not they're true teeth, and I'll explain why that is in a second. And then secondly, we have this structure in the back called the glottis. Now these lingual teeth, they are sharp, they're small, and they're going to allow for basically the assistance of swallowing food items. They're going to punch into stuff and drag it backwards, kind of like the secondary jaws of moray eels. They're just going to serve to prevent food from being pulled out of the mouth or escaping if it's alive, and they're going to allow a stronger grip on food and be able to force it into the opening of the esophagus back here. The glottis is the opening to the trachea, the breathing tube. And so, unlike in humans, you can see that Rey Dau, like a lot of reptiles, has actually two separate openings in its mouth, one to the respiratory system and one to the digestive system. And that's a pretty big advantage if you're trying to swallow super large prey items. We can see a really big glottis in snakes, and in snakes, that glottis is actually so large that it can hang out of the front of the mouth and act as basically a snorkel so that the snake can breathe even while its throat is completely full. Now, you might say, well, what if the glottis just gets crushed? Won't this animal completely choke? It's actually really hard to crush. It's got these big old cartilage rings that are like binding it, and so the glottis is going to be very, very resistant to any sort of crushing or deforming action, which is why it is very, very hard to actually choke a snake by giving it something. It can happen, but it's going to be very hard to actually crush the glottis. And similarly, Rey Dau has a relatively small skull, so having that big glottis is going to help it eat larger prey items without putting itself at risk of asphyxiation. So now let's talk for a second about tongue teeth. I've chosen to call what Rey Dau has lingual teeth because they superficially appear quite similar to the other teeth. Now, I can't actually say for certain whether they are real teeth, like we see on the left here. This is a fish in the genus Bathyphilus. It's a kind of dragonfish, and those are real teeth on their tongue. They also have real teeth everywhere else in their mouth. You can look here just like Rey Dau. They've got big old teeth on their dentary, and then they also have big old teeth on their maxilla and big old teeth on their palatine, and then teeth up there, and then some vomer teeth as well. They're very toothy, and then they also have those little teeth on the tongue. Bathyphilus dragonfish are super toothy. However, on the right, this penguin, also looks like it has teeth on its tongue, but it doesn't. All of these little points in that penguin's mouth are actually called papillae. They're not made of dentin, they're made of keratin. But these do serve the same purpose, and so they look very, very similar to how the teeth of this penguin would look if it had teeth at all. Birds have a very strong constraint against teeth. They want to reduce weight dramatically, first of all, so they already want to minimize the amount of hard, dense stuff in their skull. And second, they have completely lost the ability to develop teeth because all the tooth-bearing parts of their skull are completely covered by the rhamphotheca. So if a bird tried to grow teeth, they would punch through the rhamphotheca and severely compromise it. They just don't really have the ability to do that. So they end up just modifying their mouth in superficially tooth-like ways to get around that. This happens in several groups. In ducks and geese, they get these papillae, and they also have basically bony teeth growing out of the edges of their bill. That also happens with the pelagornithids, which are a group of extinct birds that do something quite similar. If you've ever heard of Pelagornis, one of the biggest birds ever, it also has those. But these are not true teeth. They're made of keratin. They're not made of dentin or enamel like real teeth are. But because they serve such a similar purpose, they're going to be structurally similar. And so Rey Dau, I have no real way to tell if it's got actual teeth on its tongue, true lingual teeth, or if it has lingual papillae like a penguin. Now we'll move to the lower jaw. In a lot of fields, you'll hear teeth on the lower jaw referred to as mandibular teeth. With animals like Rey Dau and a lot of fish, where they have multiple different bones that actually have teeth coming out of them on the mandible, that term is completely useless. Rey Dau is an incredibly complex animal when it comes to skull construction, and so are a lot of lobe-finned fish. Not just lobe-finned, really, any kind of fish. But my only experience with fish bones are lobe-finned fish bones, so that's what I jump to. But when we're looking at the lower jaw, we have to actually identify the kinds of these teeth that are here by the bones that they're attached to. So here we have coronoid teeth. Now, these are going to sit inside of the outside bone that's also bearing teeth there. And just like the teeth on the palatine, they're going to be small, sharp, multicuspid, and very, very compressed. They're blade-shaped. They're decently long, but not as long as, the big puncturing teeth that are sitting on the outside there. And they're basically going to be doing the same thing as the teeth in the palatine bone. Their function is basically just to trap stuff, assist with swallowing, and slice it up as it enters the mouth. Having a lot of gripping teeth on the inside of your mouth is going to allow you to develop those large, piercing, crushing teeth without losing the ability to hold on to slippery prey items, which is what Rey Dau seems to be going for. It's really got the ability to tackle a wide variety of different animals with different defense mechanisms, which makes sense because it is the apex predator of this territory. It doesn't really have to worry about competition for anything, so any animal it can exploit as a prey item, it's going to do its best to do that. This is just to make a point. This is why I do not study fish. Now, I am aware, I actually frequently say that just about everything is a fish, and that's because all land vertebrates are fish. We mammals are kind of lungfish, so are reptiles, so are amphibians. The first thing to make it onto land that had a backbone was a lungfish, and we are all descended from it. I say it was a population of lungfish that was doing that, but fish are insufferable when it comes to their mouth anatomy. They just have so much going on in here. You can look at this diagram of an animal called Eusthenurpeton. It's about 370 million years old, and you can see, rather than the quite simple construction of a lot of human skulls, for example, we only have 3 bones in our mouth that are bearing teeth. These guys have however many this is. This is an absurd amount. And this is not counting these big plates in the roof of the mouth there. I mean, there is just so much going on here. And these teeth are all different structurally. They're all serving different functions. You can see these coronoid fangs are large and they're doing puncturing. And then you have these little grippy guys on the outside here. And then the same thing on the outside here in the maxillary. There is just too much happening here. And I do not like it one bit. So that is why I don't study fish. Comparatively, you can look at some of the greatest skulls of any animals ever. Now, look, I don't like to play favorites when it comes to organisms. I think every single creature is deserving of love. But Archosaur skulls are just so beautifully constructed, and that's one of the things that draws me to them, is from, across all the Archosaurs, the big guys, the little guys, the predators, the prey, all the herbivores, the omnivores, whatever they're eating, whatever they're doing with their head, there's always some really amazing innovation going on here. And one of those amazing innovations is just how efficient they are. Crocodilians just have such wonderfully constructed skulls, and they're not simple, but they are very elegant. And they do what they need to do and not much else. Kind of like the Toyota Hilux, which is the best car ever created. If you know anything about the Toyota Hilux, you know that I'm making an apt comparison here. The skulls of crocodilians and birds, oh boy, they are pared down to their bare essentials. But boy, oh boy, do they do those bare essentials well. The bird skull doesn't have a radio, doesn't have Bluetooth, doesn't have I don't know, what's a fancy car feature? You know what I mean. These are very, very efficient crania. And fish crania are also efficient. Everything is quite efficient in evolution. But fish skulls simply do not appear efficient to the naked eye, and they're extraordinarily difficult for us humans to comprehend because there's just so much ridiculous stuff happening with their anatomy. Anyway, with that brief tangent over, let's get back to talking about video game monsters. So now we're going to move on to these teeth. These are the dentary teeth. They are big, giant fangs that are sticking out of the bottom of the skull here, and they're quite similar to the fangs of the maxilla. They are a little bit smaller. They're more compressed antero-posteriorly, which means that from the front to the back, they're skinnier than the teeth of the maxilla, and they're wider left to right. They're also not as sharp as the teeth that are situated closer to the tongue. They're also very firmly anchored into the rhamphitheca like the maxillary teeth are. And one thing that's super interesting is when this mouth closes, two of those dentary teeth actually form a cutting edge, not with the maxillary teeth, but with this, hook of the rhamphitheca. So the teeth and the beak are interacting with each other for a cutting action, which is nothing, I don't think I've ever seen that in an animal that has teeth and a beak. I have seen animals that have teeth and beaks, Hesperornis, a whole bunch of hadrosaurs, but they're always doing beak-on-beak cutting. They're never doing tooth-on-beak cutting. And I imagine that it's because the material that a beak is made out of is significantly softer than the material that a tooth is made out of. So every time this happens, the teeth are going to wear the beak down. That, however, might make the beak stay sharp, I guess. I really can't imagine the function of that. The teeth are really just going to kind of cut into the beak. But, to each their own. These teeth are interacting with the beak, and they are forming a cutting edge that way. It is possible that these teeth are somehow plated in keratin, and so they are cutting effectively with the beak, but I'm just not sure exactly why those are arranged the way they are. You may notice that I've skipped to another slide. I did that accidentally. But that's okay. Let's do a quick summary of everything that we've learned so far because, oh boy, I know it's been a lot, and I'm sorry for making everybody sit through this. But I just want to, really draw attention to how well this animal's mouth is designed and all the beautiful little details inside it. So the teeth on the outside are good at piercing, and they also form some interlocking points. They are occasionally forming these cutting edges with each other and the beak. And that's going to be pretty effective at removing large chunks of tissue. The teeth on the inside of the mouth are good at shredding and cutting, and also they're very good at gripping. They're curved backward, and they're small, and they're sharp, and oftentimes they're multicuspid, which means they have multiple points. So they're going to be very good for preventing prey escape. The teeth on the tongue are going to be grabbing food and pulling it backward, just like the pharyngeal jaws of a moray eel. They're also going to be preventing the removal of food items from the mouth because they're curving backwards as well. So all these are doing their own little function, and they're doing it exceptionally well. But not everything in the mouth is going to be, hard tissue. There's a lot of soft stuff in here. A mouth that's just bone and teeth and beak would be completely useless because you can't do anything with it. It can't open, it can't close. And that's what all these big old muscles are for. First up, we have the adductor mandibulae externus superficialis. This is, in archosaurs, typically a massive muscle. Here it's quite small. It's actually tucked back there, and I think it might have something to do with the massive size of these guys. So maybe part of the real estate that would normally attach the superficialis is being recruited to attach those big horns on the lower jaw. Then we have the adductor mandibulae externus medialis, which is by far the largest adductor mandibulae muscle. And it's also doing the same thing. All these adductor muscles are pulling the jaw closed. They're pulling the lower jaw up. So when they flex, muscles can't push. This is something that confuses a lot of people the first time they learn about muscles and how they work in general. Muscles can only pull. When they're activated, they pull together. If you want a muscle to push on something, like for example, if you do a push-up, what's happening is those muscles are going to be pulling your bones inward. You're not activating a muscle that gets bigger on, when you're, think about it this way. If you've ever gone to the gym, you've ever done a bicep curl, right? You don't feel your biceps activating when you are, doing the opposite of a bicep curl, which would probably be something like, if you ever done like a skull crush or anything that works, your triceps. they're not working your biceps in the opposite direction. They're working muscles on the opposite side of your arm. Because if I have something like this and I want to pull it this way, then I would flex this muscle on the top. And if I want to pull it the other way to go down, I would flex this muscle on the bottom. So all these adductor muscles that are so big are only going to be good at closing the jaw. This is what I'm trying to hit home. The muscles that open the jaw, by comparison, are going to be relatively small, which is, everyone thinks it's a little bit stupid that alligators can't open their mouths that quickly or effectively. You can hold an alligator's mouth shut with just your hands. Now, let me be very clear, I would not ever try to do that. It's a really terrible idea if you don't have experience. And even if you do have experience, I think there are a lot better things that you can do for your life if you aim to die with 10 fingers. However, you can very much generate more force with your hands than an alligator can with the muscles on the back of its skull that would open its jaw. And this is because so much of that muscular real estate is dedicated to closing the jaw, just like it is in Rey Dau. Now we also have the adductor mandibulae posterior. It's tucked back there. And then we have this gigantic muscle right here. This is called the pterygoides, and this attaches to the roof of the mouth, and it wraps around and attaches down there. And the pterygoides is massive. It's one of the largest muscles in the mouth. That's also a jaw closing muscle, but it's pulling it from the inside rather than the outside. It's all these adductor mandibulae muscles. They're attaching to the outside of the jaw, and then the pterygoides is attaching to the inside. Now we have the choanae. These are the internal openings of the nostrils. So when you breathe in through your nostrils, if you close your mouth, you go, breathe in, you're going to feel that air is actually coming out in the back of your throat. That's where your choanae are. For crocodilians, their choanae are sealed in by bone and just go straight down into the respiratory system because they're weird. For a lot of animals, breathing in through the nose just means pulling air into the actual cavity of the mouth. And that's quite helpful for a lot of them because it means that they can incorporate the mouth into smelling in a way that we can't. A lot of animals have what's called a vomeronasal organ, which occupies the area between the vomer and the nasal bones, and that allows them to smell very effectively with great directional sensitivity. I don't know if Rey Dau has one. I can't say for sure. I would say it's quite likely most land animals have them as far as I'm aware. Mammals have them, reptiles have them. Not sure about amphibians, but they tend to be quite effective. Then again, I don't know how much good smelling Rey Dau is going to do in a sandstorm. When it's trying to worry about not getting sand in its nostril, and it doesn't seem to have particularly large external nostrils, and you don't see it flicking its tongue around. So, maybe that's a question for another day. Regardless, that's what the choanae are for. So now that we are finally done with the mouth, we can move on to the appendicular skeleton. Now, the wings of Rey Dau are made up of 2 digits. The alula, which is the thumb, basically. It's found in birds most often. The alula of the wing in birds is quite large. It supports a big feather that can move around and basically adjust the way that air flows over the wing so that it's doing what it does best in any given situation. The alula is incredibly important. It's like a flap on an airplane wing. Then the second digit of the wing that's supporting it is ungule 2. That's your pointer finger. And Rey Dau really only has those 2 digits, at least as far as I can tell. Now, it is possible that multiple digits are fused into this alula structure or something like that. This is just what I'm going off of my kind of cursory understanding of what Rey Dau's wings would look like. I see 2 digits there. I assume that they're like birds. There's no official skeletal, so this is just what I think works best, especially with the way that the alula moves. When I say the alula is analogous to the thumb in Rey Dau, I'm hesitant to say that it's homologous. In birds, it is homologous to our thumb. It is literally the thumb of the bird that has been modified into the alula. We don't necessarily know which 2 digits are being modified in Rey Dau. I think it's probably the thumb and the pointer finger, but I can't tell for sure, so I'm going to say it's analogous. The difference between analogous and homologous. When 2 structures are homologous, it means they share an origin. So your teeth and the teeth of a bear, those are homologous. Your teeth and the crushing claw of a crab, those are analogous. They're doing the same job and they function in a similar way. When your teeth bite down, they're doing the same thing that a crab's crushing claw does, but they don't share a common origin. Ray Dow's wings are very big. They're quite large, and they are stretching all the way down to the base of the tail, which is great. More dragon designs need to be doing this. I cannot tell you how fed up I am with armpit wings, because those just do not work, ever. They look so terrible, and I just cannot sit through things like Game of Thrones and watch their dragons, because I'm like, there's no way that animal could fly. God, I'm such a pedant. I'm sorry. But anyway, you can see here, this is their humerus, this is the radius, and the ulna. These are presumably all the metacarpals, and there's one digit, and then up here, there's another digit. So Ray Dau has at least 2 fingers. This might be a fused thumb, and this could be the pointer finger, and that could be the middle finger. I don't know. It's hard to say. You can see that Ray Dow's wings are very broad. And they have an aspect ratio, which is basically the shape of the wing that we would associate with a soaring animal, like a hawk or a vulture. And additionally, they have this huge slot right here. Now, why on earth would you have a slot in your wing? Well, turns out slotted wingtips are just kind of the best ever. When you are flying, you want minimal turbulence. And when you have a big single wingtip that's just sitting out here like that, it's going to generate a little vortex. And it's going to be doing one really big vortex if you're a very big animal. And so a lot of these soaring birds that are trying to minimize the energy they spend when they're on the wing are going to develop these slotted wings that generate a bunch of little tiny vortices instead of one big one, which actually has a lot of benefits for energy conservation. These slotted wings were initially noticed in soaring species, so it was assumed to just be an adaptation for soaring flight, but that's actually not the case. It just seems that maybe soaring species need to be more energy efficient because of their lifestyle, and so they develop these slotted wings, but a lot of flapping species as well. So it doesn't really say much about Ray Dow's lifestyle. We know that it soars around a lot, but we do know that it's trying to conserve energy and trying to be as stable as possible in flight. And that makes sense because the rest of its body is not exactly aerodynamic. However, the structure of its scales might be doing something similar. Like I said, I recently read a paper that talked about how bat ears do something quite similar to slotted wings to generate those little vortices, and so maybe the scales on its body are doing that as well when it's flying. So if Ray Dau is such an efficient flyer, and it's so preoccupied with being an efficient flyer, at least as best as it can with a tuning fork stuck to its face, why is it flying in a storm? Well, storms have wind currents that are going a lot of different directions, and big birds that spend a lot of time flying are going to use wind currents to get up in the air easier. Now, most of the time birds stay grounded during a storm for a few reasons. One, when it's raining, which it usually is when there's a big storm like that, and it's probably raining in the windward plains too, it's just that the water evaporates before it hits the ground because it's so hot. That's what happens in a lot of desert sandstorms or dry sandstorms. Or sorry, not sandstorms, dry thunderstorms. Not sandstorms you don't need rain for. But when we see that sort of thing happening, that's going to make the birds wet, and it's going to make it suck for them to fly. Anything getting wet is going to have a hard time flying. However, in a desert, this is mitigated because the air is going to be less humid anyway. And for Ray Dau, it could have some unique adaptations. Perhaps that's another reason why the scales are like that. A lot of desert animals have really deeply furrowed scales that actually channel water between them and move the water around the body. Maybe that's going to allow Ray Dau to get the water off of it more effectively and fly at high altitudes. Who knows? Point being, it's using the storm in some way to get itself airborne with those, upswinging air currents. When you have a good headwind, it's going to be a lot easier to get a big body like that off the ground. With birds, they often do this with thermal currents, where hot air is rising naturally, and you'll see there'll be hot air kind of going up like that, and the birds will go up, and then they'll circle around at the top here until they get good altitude, and then they'll see another thermal current over there, and then they'll go ooh-wee, and they'll glide around, and then they'll end up low altitude over here, and then they'll ride it back up, and they'll go somewhere else where there's a big thermal. And especially when raptors are migrating, they'll do this over and over again. Vultures will do it to forage. And there's actually a fairly good social component to this. The vultures will actually gather at these thermal currents. They'll lead each other to them, and they'll all go up together. But Rey Dao being very large and it having that big alula and slotted wings are going to help keep it stable in a stormy environment like this and allow it to take advantage of the rising air that might be happening here. Also, without expending the energy to flap. That's the other thing, is it doesn't have to actually, generate lift actively if it's just gliding up rising air. Another issue with storms that Rey Dao is going to have to surmount is that storms produce a great amount of natural electricity, which is going to make hunting with sound terrible. It's going to make it very, very hard to do that. The wind is blowing everywhere, so smelling things precisely is going to be extremely difficult. And all of the sand blowing everywhere is going to make it really hard to see anything. So Rey Dao needs to be able to hunt without hearing, smelling, or seeing. Now, if it was underwater, it could potentially feel where its prey was, but even then the wind would be disrupting it. So it has to figure out a way to detect something without using any of those senses, which is probably why it's evolved its electric organs. Now, the senses associated with electronavigation and basically using electricity to orient yourself are very complex and very old, and they appear in some of the earliest vertebrates. But the actual production of electricity through specialized electrical organs is fairly recent and also more complex and less widespread. Nevertheless, it has evolved many, many times in a lot of different groups of organisms. So because it's so different, it is, entirely possible that Rey Dao's electric organ works entirely different to anything that we know about today, because every group of animals that have electric organs that work slightly differently. So Rey Dao is probably doing electricity in its own way. However, I'm still going to use the example of the electric eel as our analog here. One, because electric eels are probably the most specialized animal when it comes to producing electricity as much as they can. Their method of hunting is quite analogous to Rey Dao. They hunt in super, super dark, murky water where they can't, feel or see their prey at all. And they have a similar setup of like electrical organs specialized for the same purposes that Rey Dao's are. So, what is electrogenesis? It is the specialized, production of electricity. In highly electric animals, electrogenesis, sorry, that's a heck of a word. Electrogenesis is done through specialized cells called electrocytes that we went over earlier. They are bundled together in these big, long organs that look like a battery series that go through the entire length of the body. For this electric eel, everything that doesn't have to do with electricity is up here. The bottom, and by bottom, I mean anus of the electric eel, is right there. This whole area of the body is pretty much entirely devoted to moving around a little bit and generating huge shocks. Everything else important is up here. Producing large amounts of electricity is extraordinarily difficult for an organism to do. It requires a ton of specialization and a lot of physical real estate. These electrocytes are stacked together like Pringles cans, and there's a low electrical resistance between them, so electricity can flow across them. And this allows electrical current to go from one side to the other side of the animal very, very quickly. When electrocytes activate, they consume ATP, which is like cell fuel, basically. It's the end product of basically all the energy that your body is ever trying to generate. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. And they use this ATP to pump sodium across their membrane, which creates basically a difference in electrical charge because they're taking sodium ions, which are charged particles. So they're creating a difference in electrical charge on the inside and outside of the membrane. And then what that does is it creates an electric shock when enough of them are doing that. So we see all of these very specialized electrical organs in the electric eel, but where are they sitting in Rey Dao? So central to my hypothesis, I guess you could say here, is this main organ is the one that's going to sit ventrally down in the tail. The hunter's organ is going to be that thing that's running along the neck. And the sax organ
is probably those lower guys. The sacs organ is going to be very difficult for me to place because it doesn't necessarily have to be in a specific spot along Rey Dau's body. The main organ is the largest, which is why I think it's those big ones in the tail that were presumably running the entire length of the body and terminating up here. The sacs organ and the hunter's organ are a little bit different. I'm going to get into the functions of all Rey Dau's electric organs in a second, but first let's talk about how electrolocation actually works. This is one of the main purposes of the production of electricity. Underwater, electrical signals go everywhere relatively fast and relatively easily. And so it takes a very low voltage to actually produce or receive an electrical signal. Most fish have a pretty good ability to detect electricity through a part of something called the lateral line system, which is a big strip of sensory tissue that runs along the side of a fish. And included in the lateral line are all these receptors that you see on the right in the face of this animal called a dogfish, which is a kind of shark. It's neither a dog nor, well, I guess it is a fish because all sharks are fish, but whatever. It's not a bony fish, which is what most people think of when they say fish. But yeah, so the shark has ampullae of Lorenzini all over its face, and those ampullae of Lorenzini are going to pick up on electrical signals, even really, really tiny ones. When you splash around in the water and you're next to a shark, that shark is going to know where you are, not based on the splashing necessarily, even though it can definitely feel that, but it might also detect the electricity that your body is producing from your nerve signals that are being used to flex your muscles, which is crazy and also really, really cool. And that's very small amounts of electricity, but a lot of fish are very sensitive to it because that's important information that you're missing out on if you're not detecting it. Now, not every fish can do it. There's a few fish that don't have these ampullae of Lorenzini. I know lampreys don't, but it's a pretty widespread thing. And yeah. And while we have a shark up here, I just want to say sharks, they're not monsters. No animals are monsters. A lot of people are really scared of sharks. Not that you shouldn't be scared of them. It's not like they're, giant aquatic puppies. But the reality is, if you're getting into the beach, it's kind of like walking onto a national park where there's mountain lions. Are you going to get attacked by a mountain lion? No, not necessarily. It's incredibly unlikely that a mountain lion is actually going to jump on you. If you step across the trail and there's a mountain lion standing there, is your life in danger? Yes. Treat these animals with respect. Give them a fair distance. Don't mess around with them. They're powerful predators and you're in their home. I think there really needs to be a midline between people treating animals as though they're cute and that's all they're doing and they're harmless and all that, and demonizing them. Because pretty much every single take I've seen about animals from people who don't know a ton about them is saying that they're monsters or saying that they're harmless, cute puppies. There's almost no in between. That's probably an effect of the internet. But as someone who studies animals like birds, where pretty much the consensus on all birds is, oh, they're completely harmless. There's not really anything that we have to do to worry about them besides cassowaries, which are super murder machines and they'll kill you on sight. That kind of thing is something that bugs me entirely because it's not the case. They're both in middle grounds. There's a lot of birds that can seriously mess you up if you don't give them their space, even if they're small. And cassowaries are far from monsters. They're beautiful and intelligent animals. And if you give them their personal space, you'll be fine. They're plant eaters. They're not going to hunt you down. So think about that. Animals, they're just trying to go about their life like you go about yours. When you get into the water with a shark, you are taking a risk of a shark attack, but not because a shark is a murderous creature, because you're entering its home. And when you go into someone's house uninvited, there's a risk that they're going to punch you. And for a shark, its mouth is its only way of figuring things out about the world, to a degree. They're like babies, but not like babies in that they're harmless. They're like babies in that they like biting things. Now, electroreception is generally associated with animals that spend a lot of time in water, but there's actually a few terrestrial animals that have a sense of electroreception. Echidnas and platypuses both hunt with electroreception. Platypuses live in water, so we're not going to talk about them for a second. But echidnas live on land, and you can see they actually have these sensory structures on their quote-unquote beaks. Those are actually just really highly modified lips. They're not the same as beaks in turtles and birds and dinosaurs. But there has been studies
done that showed that they can pick up on the tiny little electric fields generated by insects that are moving around in very humid environments. So there is actually a precedent in some cases for electroreception sensitive enough to pick up electrical signals traveling through air on land. Not very strong ones, and not from very far away. These are animals that are sticking their noses maybe inches from these ants, and these receptors have to be extremely, extremely sensitive, but they are there. And so electroreception can sometimes be useful on land. So why on earth would Ray Dau ever actually develop electroreception? What kind of selective pressures could cause a land-dwelling animal to just suddenly jump to having electroreception? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be that Ray Dau started out as a land-dwelling animal. Echidnas likely come from a group of aquatic mammals, and a whole bunch of bizarre traits that you're like, well, how did that evolve? How is that useful in anything other than its current form? This is something that trips people up a lot. Very rarely did something evolve for what it's currently being used for. Our thumbs did not evolve for effective object manipulation. That's what they're used for right now, but the first thumbs absolutely were not for effective object manipulation. The first thumbs were just modified fin rays that were designed to help keep tetrapods stood up better on land and prevent them from falling over. Is a weak, non-flexible thumb useful for object manipulation? No. But a weak, non-flexible thumb is very good for keeping you stood up in one place. And so that's where that happened. And then, somewhere along the line, thumbs got more flexible, not necessarily because these animals were manipulating objects, but probably because they were grabbing tree branches. And then from there, it's a pretty reasonable jump. So when we're doing this, we're not necessarily looking at why electroreception might be useful to Ray Dau in its current lifestyle, current like electrical current. We're looking at how electroreception would be useful to an animal physiologically similar to Ray Dau, or in a environment that is near or around the windward plains, or perhaps the previous state of the windward plains, which is something that we'll go into in just a second, because chances are the windward plains might have actually recently been underwater. Oh, shocker. I can't make any more electricity jokes. But yeah, so I have two hypotheses regarding this that I'm going to go over in a second. Two potential reasons for Ray Dau's electrical organ to evolve, instead of jumping to something super powerful, useful for hunting. Electrical organs can't just show up and be useful for zapping things, right? They have to start with weaker iterations that are probably used for sensory activity or something like that. So what would cause this sort of structure to evolve in a flying wyvern? My first thought was a secondarily aquatic lifestyle for a diving predator. As we've covered previously, much of what is now the Forbidden Lands and the New World were likely underwater at one point, and this is because the Monster Hunter universe, or the Monster Hunter world, seems to be going through an ice age. When ice ages happen, all of the solid or liquid water gathers at the poles and other places and solidifies, and so that drastically reduces sea level. This happened, for example, all across the world during the last ice age in the Pleistocene, which is how things like Beringia formed. If Monster Hunter is currently going through an ice age, that would explain why so many animals that seem to be well adapted to the open ocean are in relatively shallow areas. For example, we see Lagiacris in open oceans, but there are Lagiacris populations that seem to be in the Scarlet Forest. That's probably a bad example. I think a better example would be things like spear tuna, which are clearly open ocean predators, and all those big pelagic fish. And we also see things like petracanthes, which are deep sea cave fish that show up in isolated caves across the New World and the Forbidden Lands that they would only have been able to access if those areas were once covered in water, because they so rarely come up to the surface that they wouldn't really have a way to make it over there. Additionally, Gogmasios probably was once aquatic. Additionally, another point, the Rotten Vale and the
what's it called? The rotten veil and the oil well basin share a lot in common biologically, in terms of the animals that are there, and those animals likely would have only been able to get there if they were both underwater. Things like the jellyfish. That couldn't have, made it over by walking over land, for example. If that's the only way that those jellyfish could have made it over would be, if those areas were much closer biologically than they are now. Anyway, that being said, it is also possible that those areas could have just split in half. But the sparkler jellies are implied to be like literally the same species. This is clearly a pretty short-term thing. Anyway, time to address the flying wyvern in the room that you guys have all been staring at on this slide. Harpios seems to be Rey Dau's closest relative. When we're looking at Harpios, a few things come to mind. It's got this big slotted wing, just like Rey Dau. It has the exact same occlusion pattern of the Rhamphotheca. It has a high rear edge, and then it slopes downward, and then it comes up to facilitate these two prongs at the bottom, and then you have that poke down there, and then you have this big prominent like bow structure on the top, and then you have a chin on the bottom. They also have extraordinarily derived skull muscles that are capable of swinging around a large bony process on the back of the head. Now, Harpios's is attached to one point, and Rey Dau has two, but the fundamental purpose of those derived cranial muscles is going to be the same. And they have the exact same resting posture, which is something that I don't see a compelling reason to change evolutionarily, right? The way that an animal sits is something that would be fairly highly conserved. Rey Dau and Harpios rest in the exact same way. I realize I misspelled Harpios here. If we consider momentarily that Rey Dau and Harpios are close relatives, and we look at the ecology of Harpios, we can start to learn that Harpios is an underwater predator. Harpios, however, doesn't really seem like it would be able to hunt effectively with sight. Why is that? I'll get into that in a second. The key point here is that Harpios needs some kind of other sensory apparatus to effectively navigate underwater. It can't just be doing it with sight. Which is why, controversially I may suggest, that Harpios's spear, the thing that sticks out of the front of its face, might not only be a method of prey capture, but some kind of electrosensitive structure that can pick up electric signals while it's swimming around underwater when it's diving. So why can't Harpios just see underwater? Why can't it be a sight predator chasing after all those fish? Eyes suck underwater if you are primarily used to seeing on land. You just really can't see the same way underwater as you do if you're an air-breathing animal, or an animal that is looking around outside of the water. That's because water distorts light in a very different way than air, and so your eye has to be quite well adapted to receiving light in the way that it's going to be distorted underwater. Otherwise, you are going to basically have a permanent astigmatism regardless of how your eyes are developed. If you are seeing in land or water, you have to optimize for one of those areas. And because Harpios is a flying animal, it does not have the choice to optimize its vision for underwater use. Flying animals need to be able to see really, really well in order to avoid smashing into stuff. If a land-dwelling animal that doesn't have to fly around needs to see well underwater, sure, it can develop good underwater vision. Because if a seal runs into something at full speed because it didn't see it, seals can't run that fast. If a Harpios flies into something at full speed because it couldn't see it, it's going to die. And so for Harpios, seeing outside of the water is going to be very important, which means that it does not have the ability to specialize its eyes for underwater use. It needs another way to sense movement under the surface. Crocodilians are an example of optimizing that in the other direction. They have pretty great vision, but it sucks underwater. A lot of people, for some reason, for a long time thought that crocodiles could see very well underwater, which I don't know why they did do that. because they literally close their eyes underwater. They slide their nictitating membrane over them, and they're like, oh, it's like goggles just because it's translucent. No, they really can't see much of anything. I mean, they can kind of see, but they're really not that great at it. But they don't need to be, because if you see all these little black dots around this crocodile's eye, those are all incredibly sensitive little organs for sensing their environment. Those are called ISOs, or integumentary sense organs, and each one of those little black dots is about as sensitive as the fingers of a primate, the fingertips. And when all those are packed onto their face, they can see and, well, not see, but they can feel and detect some pretty exceptional stuff. They are just absolute marvels of biology. And that's what you need to do when you're hunting underwater without sight optimized for underwater use. So Harpios either has some completely crazy sensory structure that is, off the wall bonkers. It doesn't have a particularly flexible neck like underwater birds, for example, like cormorants do. And so because of that, it needs to have some kind of underwater sense that's going to allow it to navigate through those big shoals of fish and pick out a prey item and dispatch it effectively. You might make the argument, if you were shooting this down, to say that Harpios' spear probably isn't a complex and sensitive organ because it's being used as a weapon, and that's counterintuitive to make use of the most sensitive part of your body as a prey-killing tool. Well, the most sensitive part of a crocodile's body is its face, and I can assure you, a crocodile's skull, which is, again, the most sensitive part of its face and its major way of navigating the world with underwater, with all those complex sensory structures that tell it all the information it needs to know about the underwater environment, is also its sword and its shield. A crocodile's face is going to be the part of the body that sustains the most injuries to the bone of any other area of the body, and this goes way back into ancient history too. The skulls of these animals are brutalized over the course of their life. They're also the only way that they really use to catch prey. Crocodiles aren't grabbing stuff with their hands or slapping it to death with their tails. So their chief sensory organ, when they're underwater, is also their weapon, and it's the part of their body that's receiving the most injury. So this is absolutely not a compelling argument against Harpios' ability to perceive electricity. Now you may ask, what? How could this happen? There is absolutely no way that just because it spends a significant amount of time in the water, a highly derived tetrapod could just re-evolve electroreception. How is that even making sense? Just transitioning slightly to a swimming lifestyle is not going to give this animal the ability to produce and pick up on electrical signals. Allow me to remind you of the platypus. Sorry, that was very smug of me. I'm sure everybody remembers that I was talking about the platypus earlier, but it actually has a completely convergently evolved method of electroreception. And additionally, the Guyana dolphin also can detect electrical signals to a similar degree. So the ability of these animals to just convergently develop electroreceptors out of other nerve tissue is pretty apparent. And this might be more widespread than we know. The authors of this Guyana dolphin paper show that it's possible that any marine mammal has some kind of electrosensory component because the structures that support this electroreception are actually really, really old, and very minimal modifications have to be made to them before they start picking up on electrical activity. So the development of electroreception is actually, evolutionarily speaking, not that hard. You have to turn on some old hardware, or in this case, just modify some current hardware a little bit. And so it's not actually that big of an evolutionary jump for something like Harpios to start developing that electroreception. It's honestly kind of a natural jumping off point from just getting an exceptionally sensitive structure on your face. So we don't know exactly, obviously, what kind of mechanosensory organs that wyverns are going to have and if they can be modified that easily. But I think this is a pretty compelling argument that it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge evolutionary jump for this sort of structure to appear. And keep in mind, I'm not making the argument that Harpios is producing electricity, just that it's electrosensitive, that it's able to feel the electricity generated by these fish as they move and contract their muscles, like the Guyana dolphin, like the platypus, like a shark. From there, the development of electricity production for electronavigation could come with a transition from clear open water to murkier water, where an animal is going to have to rely more on those extra sensitive electroreceptive organs, and maybe to the point where it's going to start picking up on its own electricity, and then it can use that to navigate by telling the difference between conductive and non-conductive objects underwater. So yes, that's my argument for why I think Harpios might be able to pick up electrical signals, and coupled with my argument for Harpios being Rey Dau's closest relative, I think the origin of Rey Dau as a murky water flying wyvern predator, or at least somewhere along the line, the development of a Rey Dau-like animal that's an ancestor to Rey Dau in that environment is relatively compelling. That would probably happen somewhere in the Forbidden Lands, considering that's where Harpios and Rey Dau were from. And before I jump into this, I do want to mention that pre-Ice Age, assuming the Ice Age idea was true, a lot of the land that is currently dry that would have been underwater is going to be relatively shallow. And so for a diving predator, like Harpios, for example, being able to dive into shallow, perhaps murky water, or even just any shallow water without strong vision, and being able to tell where the bottom is by sending out an electrical signal and seeing how conductive whatever is directly in front of you is. For example, if it's water, it's going to be very conductive, and if it's the bottom of the ocean, it's not going to be very conductive. If you're diving in shallow areas that are generated by this, rising sea level pre-Ice Age that are covering up what's currently areas like the Windward Plains and that big dune ocean that the Monster Hunter people go across in the beginning of the cutscene. Those areas are not going to be particularly deep, so it's actually going to be a pretty solid advantage to be able to tell where the bottom is without having to see it. And so that's also another possible origin. Additionally, electro signaling may have come about as a communication sort of structure. Now, this doesn't have the restrictions on it that hunting does. It doesn't have to be particularly strong. It just has to be, good enough to send a signal. And sending out little electrical pulses as a communication strategy is pretty interesting, but it is possible. Turns out that electrosignaling is actually really, really good for communication because electricity is shockingly attractive. I am 64 slides into this presentation, and I have made it the entire time and only made one joke about shocking and a pun like that so far. I've been trying to restrain myself because, oh my gosh, it's so easy. In all seriousness, in a lot of electric fish, these signals, the electrical signals produced by males and females, are sexually dimorphic. Animals are extremely intelligent, and basically all of them do more talking to each other than we give them credit for. This is something that me and many, many other folks who are much more qualified and intelligent than I am have been on about for a very long time. In basically any group of animals that people study enough, they're like, X is a lot more communicative and intelligent than most people realize. Fish, octopuses, probably snails, insects, definitely. For me, crocodilians. No one understands how complex crocodilian communication is. But that's true of basically every animal. And they all communicate in exceptionally different ways. One of these ways in fish that communication occurs is these electrical signals. When Rey Dau is living in a sandstorm, finding and properly identifying a mate is a very, very big issue, and being able to do that consistently is a big reproductive advantage. If Rey Dau could simply touch each other and not have to roar over the current of the sandstorm or visually communicate with signaling, if they're, and keep in mind this is a hypothetical Rey Dau ancestor that's going to sit down in the desert with a potential mate. Because these guys only come out during sandstorms, these guys can't see each other. They can barely hear each other, and they're probably going to have a hard time smelling. So shooting out those little electrical signals, because if we're assuming that Rey Dau came from an aquatic ancestor that already developed electroreception, producing little vibrations and electrical signals just by shaking the muscle tissue and stuff is going to be a way that they can communicate with each other if they're touching. And from there, amplifying those electrical signals is going to be a huge selective advantage. The Rey Dau that can communicate the most effectively are going to be the most successful reproductively.
And there, boy oh boy, you have hit the gas on the selective pressure, and those signals are going to get stronger and stronger, and these animals are going to get better and better at detecting them until eventually they don't have to be touching each other per se. They can do it from a little bit away, and that range is just going to increase and increase because the Ray Dao with the biggest range, the strongest communicators, the ones that can broadcast the strongest signals, again, they're going to be the most reproductively successful. So this is my other alternative, not necessarily mutually exclusive hypothesis. Personally, I think it's likely that both of these stories are true to an extent, because these are both really, really compelling reasons for why Ray Dao would be doing this. But yeah, so that's in a nutshell the gist of why electric communication would be very effective for this animal. So now, if Ray Dao is already able to produce those signals over a distance because its electrical abilities have gotten that powerful, then having a larger search radius, even if it's not powerful enough to use a current for hunting, having a larger search radius, more sensitive electroreceptors, and stronger electrical signaling is going to make you even more effective, until eventually we could get to something like we see in the modern state, where Ray Dao might just be communicating with each other with these electrical signals over long distance while flying in the storm. Eventually, they could probably also use those electrical receptors to start detecting the muscle movements of animals on the ground while they're flying low. This could also be an explanation of why Ray Dao flies so low, despite being, a relatively well-adapted flyer that could be coasting much higher above the surface. If it's flying lower, it can pick up the electrical signals from those animals moving on the ground much more effectively, even if it can't see them very well. If Ray Dao never changed environments, I think this would be the only, real explanation for why this trait could evolve on its own. I still don't think it's that compelling. I think Ray Dao still probably came from a semi-aquatic ancestor, like a diving bird, something similar to Harpios, that was diving in shallow water prior to our current ice age of the monster in our universe, where there's a rapid sea level decrease. The sea levels dropped. Ray Dao becomes more terrestrial. And it co-opts its electrical signaling or co-opts its electrical reception abilities and electrogenesis abilities to be a more effective hunter and a more effective communicator over longer and longer distances in a terrestrial environment. Now we come to actually a really, really interesting conundrum. And this is something that happens in electrical fish, where when there's two of the same species in the area that are using a very similar electrical signal, and they're both hunting with their electricity. And I'm going to draw two Ray Dao here. These guys are not very good. I know I do my other drawings, but they take a while, and I'm doing this in like 2 seconds. This is an interpretive drawing of Ray Dao hunting in the sky, and they're sending out these electrical signals to try and figure out if there's anything in front of them. And this Ray Dao is also sending back electrical signals, and these are going to interact with each other. They're going to interact with each other's sensory organs, and these Ray Dao are going to freak out and not know what to do, and they might even crash into each other because they're confused. So how are they going to adjust for that if they're, shooting out these interacting frequencies of electricity that are going to completely screw with each other's senses and prevent them from hunting in the same area? So this is something called the jamming avoidance response, and we see this in electric fish, most particularly, I believe, knife fish, gymnotiforms. And when two knife fish are searching for prey or navigating their environment with these weak electrical signals that would be interacting with each other, and so this will start with two animals putting out the same initial frequency for searching for prey. So they'll do a pulse of electricity at a certain frequency, and those pulses are at a very similar frequency or the same frequency, and so they're going to mess with each other. They're disrupting each other's signals, and it's going to give them some serious interference and prevent them from navigating their environment effectively. So then they detect this. They both do. And these signals are almost never going to be the exact same frequency. One of them is going to be slightly higher than the other. And so what happens then is the animal that knows it has the slightly lower frequency will drop its frequency lower, and the animal that has the slightly higher frequency will shoot its frequency up. So now they're operating at completely different frequencies and not interrupting each other's sensory systems. And this is one of the coolest behaviors I've ever heard about, because It is just so amazing. These animals are basically avoiding radio interference, but they're doing it with their electrical signals. And I have to say, there's almost no way in which we don't see this behavior in Ray Dao because, like these knife fish, electricity is going to be its primary way of figuring its way around the world when it's not able to see or hear or smell anything in the thunderstorm. So, shooting out a reliable pulse of electricity is very important for that. And I'm sure people will think, oh, how is it navigating with electricity if there's lightning happening? Yes, the lightning is going to confuse it a little bit, but the lightning is going to be relatively infrequent. These animals are not navigating with big pulses of electricity like lightning strikes. They're navigating with a slow or a high frequency, low voltage pulse that's just going like pop, 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 like echolocation. In the same way that a sperm whale is not going to be confused if you bang a pot and a pan together for a half second near it. It might go, ah, but it's not going to be completely unable to navigate in an environment that's occasionally noisy. Now, persistent noise would cause an issue, which is why there's a big issue with boats in the ocean. But if there's just occasional loud noises, it's not going to screw with echolocation in the same way that occasional pulses of like high volume electricity probably wouldn't mess with electroreception that much. Anyway, this is how two Ray Dao, I think, would avoid each other in a situation like the storm when they are shooting out similar electrical frequencies in order to navigate their environment. Once an animal has this ability to produce and receive electrical signals, there are just so many different things that you can do with it. Selection takes off and it can evolve in so many different directions. When you have electroreception, you are completely immune to camouflage. There is no real way that an animal can be stealthy around you because even its heart beating is going to produce an electrical signal. So it will make you an incredibly effective hunter at shorter ranges. It will allow these animals to hunt in otherwise impossible to navigate conditions. Electric eels hunt in such murky water, they cannot see a damn thing. They have tiny, tiny eyes, but they can electrically navigate those environments, and they do it fantastically. And they're really the only animals that can hunt in those completely blind conditions without going off of things like smell or touch. This electricity is also incredibly effective as a defense against other predators. Any other fish the size of an electric eel would be a very easy meal for a caiman. But an electric eel will absolutely make a caiman think twice about biting into it. There are cases where electric eels kill caimans, which will certainly prevent that caiman from eating any more electric eels if that happens. Usually the electric eel also dies if it gets to that point where the electric eel is discharging enough to kill the caiman. By that point it's probably already in its mouth. But electric eels, for them, that big electrical pulse is a massive deterrent to predators. And Ray Dao, not that it has to deal with a ton of predators, but it's anything that is going to try and take food from Ray Dao is definitely going to think twice about dealing with the living lightning strike. It also allows this animal to remotely control prey items, which will both prevent them from escaping and prevent them from hurting the predator. This is something that not a lot of people take into account, but prey items in most cases are incredibly, incredibly dangerous. We don't often think of like wildebeest being able to fight back effectively against lions, but they absolutely can. If these animals are not careful, they're oftentimes built for speed and built to be as light as possible. Especially Ray Dao, it's a flying animal. It needs to be able to protect itself from injury caused by prey items. Hell, a keratinoth could probably mess Ray Dao up substantially just by running into it and clawing at it. And yes, parts of Ray Dao's body are armored, but no animal is immune to that kind of damage. So being able to ensure that a prey item can't effectively struggle and swipe at you while you're going up to grab it through that remote control of its muscles is super important and very, very advantageous. Similarly, it also allows hunting from a distance. If you don't have to actually close distance with your prey item, it makes it safer and easier for you to take it out. Also, it's a lot easier to find a mate, and you can do that silently. You don't have to broadcast your location to all these other animals in the area. A really cool example of this sort of thing is, I think it's black dragonfish, where they have these red lights on their bodies. Here we go. This is my black dragonfish. And most fish at this depth, because red light is just not common that far down in the ocean, just can't see it. In the same way that we can't see the frequencies of light that are not necessarily common on Earth. And so these black dragonfish They can communicate with each other by flashing these red light patches. In the same way, because nothing that lives around Rey Dau can detect electrical signals, it's going to be able to communicate with its potential partners or rivals silently without being detected at all. This isn't even necessarily for collaborative hunting. It could be for mating. It could be just to avoid conflict. If one Rey Dao is broadcasting a signal and says, I'm big and strong, I'm already hunting over here, it's going to prevent a physical altercation between those two animals and help them save resources. So these are all incredible, incredible uses that it could be using these things for. And this is more of a fun, speculative section. But these are also very compelling reasons for this sort of thing to continue to evolve in the powerful direction that it does. These are all very, very good selective pressures for the use of electroreception, which is such a versatile tool. And that's why it's so widespread amongst fish. There are very, very few fish alive today that don't do electroreception. And among them, there are several species that do electrogenesis, which is not necessarily a natural next step, but with strong selective pressure, it can be. Now, as we're looking deeper into Rey Dau's internal anatomy and looking at how it actually is producing these pulses, we suddenly hit a kind of major conundrum, which is that in reading a lot of stuff surrounding it, and particularly the notes on it in game, we get this. Rey Dau is apparently able to store, amplify, and discharge the storm's electricity. Now, hold on. Electroreception and electrogenesis is quite well documented in animals, and Rey Dau is certainly capable of electrogenesis. It doesn't rely on storing the storm's lightning. It can activate lightning for a very, very long time after the storm is over. It's probably not storing massive amounts of electricity, and that's all it's doing. It definitely still has electrical organs. But these electrical organs might somehow be operated by a biological battery. And so how the heck would that work? So there are two kinds of batteries. There's primary batteries, which you make, you don't recharge, and they run out of electricity over time. And then there's secondary batteries, which you can recharge by further, hitting them with electrical pulses. I'll preface this by saying that I do not study electrical engineering. I study paleontology. And while I do use a fair number of electrical tools in that field, I don't know that much about how batteries work. So if I get something wrong here, I will apologize. If you know more about batteries than I do, feel free to completely debunk my ideas and explain how this doesn't work. But this is just what I'm going off of based on reading a couple papers in a field that I have almost zero familiarity with. So while a lot of these secondary batteries are manufactured with rare materials that are hard to access naturally, like lithium-ion batteries, for example, in your computer, they're very efficient, but you need to get all that lithium, which Rey Dau probably can't do, and to create a rechargeable battery. However, if you'll notice here on the right, these are a list of battery compounds in rechargeable batteries from a paper that I was looking at, and you'll notice they don't have crazy chemical names. This one is called a turnip cactus battery. This one is called a turnip bitter orange battery. This one is a turnip radish battery. This one is an onion cactus battery. This one is an onion orange battery, and this one is an onion radish battery. Those materials don't seem to be very difficult to access. Now, batteries work by basically moving electrons between a part of the battery called the cathode and a part called the anode. The cathode and the anode are suspended in these two things called half cells, which are filled with electrolytes, which are like basically ions dissolved in a solution that can conduct electricity. There's also this part in the middle, which is called a salt bridge, right there, and that's going to allow the ions to flow from one to the other without actually allowing for the exchange of fluid. The salt bridge is basically a tube of solution with a diaphragm at each end that's going to allow a little bit of electrical exchange without mixing the liquids together. So what could Rey Dau build a battery of out of just the stuff that's in its body? Now we know a lot of elements are hard to get access to naturally, but there are some compounds which have these properties that are not difficult to get access to. Onion juice is actually pretty good at suspending a cathode. cactus juice is pretty good at suspending an anode. This salt bridge can be made by suspending potassium chloride in solution, which can be accessed from dried lake/sea beds, which Rey Dau is going to have a lot of access to because it's in the middle of a desert, which seems to be an ancient seabed, judging by the geology of the area, and also the massive recession of sea level that has occurred relatively recently in the modern universe. And then our cathode and anode could be comprised of planar carbon, which is just graphite. And Rey Dau could conceivably make something conductive inside its body, by doing that and arranging carbon in a natural crystalline structure, like how clams do with their shell, where they basically produce these carbonate crystals. It could do something similar with something graphite-esque that has similar properties. So yeah, that's how Rey Dau could build a battery out of its own tissues. I don't have any precedent for what a naturally occurring battery would look like, which is just incredibly bizarre that this is even a concept that they thought of. But yeah, I don't know how this would look biologically, but all the components that you would need are there. I guess this kind of thing could be suspended in a sack and recharged every time the lightning strikes. But yeah, that's our biological battery. So how would we direct the lightning to the battery tissues? For this, Rey Dau would need certain parts of its body to conduct electricity better than the others in order to be struck by lightning and then not have that cause all of its muscles to spasm and kill it. I think probably the best candidate for this would be the outside of the body, which is made up of those bright yellow scales, and those could be quite highly conductive. We know that Keratinoth have conductive scales, which they are using to ground themselves and protect against lightning strikes. So Rey Dau could also have similar conductive scales for this environment. But, I hear you say, if Rey Dau's scales are conductive, then how come the armor makes you resist thunder damage? That's an oversight, or maybe disproves that the scales are conductive at all. Maybe they're just insulators. Well, electricity takes the path of least resistance. When you get struck by lightning and you're wearing conductive armor, it's going to shunt the electricity around the less conductive material, which is your skin, and into the ground. This will protect you from significant nerve damage. However, do not go out into a lightning storm with chainmail on, because that chainmail is going to absorb a lot of energy, heat up, and probably burn you substantially. People can handle low voltage electricity just fine and have chainmail pass it through their body while it's grounding them. The same thing happens if you're wearing an anti-static bracelet and you're working on a computer. But if you are getting hit with substantial amounts of electricity, these will not protect you from bodily harm. They will just introduce you to a whole different kind of bodily harm, which is full body burns. Anyway, let's now finally talk about how the electrical organs work in Rey Dau specifically. So when Rey Dau gets ready to shoot off a bolt of electricity, it's going to close those horns on its face and basically, I suppose it's completing a circuit and allowing electricity to flow through those electrical organs. It's going to swing everything forward. And this is where we get into the neck organs. They pop out. And I was watching an Unnatural History Channel video a while ago, and he thinks that they are analogous to the main electrical organ of the electric eel. However, I'm going to disagree. I love you, Unnatural History Channel. You're one of the coolest guys ever. And I really appreciate your content. You've been doing this a lot longer than I have, and I really hope that you're watching this. And the biggest thing I hope is that if Unnatural History Channel ended up clicking on this video, that he managed to make it the, what is it? Holy shit, 2.5 hours of recording that have brought me to this point. And he has not clicked off because of how bored he is. Unnatural History Channel, if you're watching this, please don't take offense to this. I simply think that you may have made an incorrect statement. I think that the neck organs of Rey Dau are more similar to the hunter's organs of electric eels rather than the main electrical organ. And I think this because of a study that was done by these few researchers in 2021 that looked at the patterns of discharge in electric eels. So you see there's this low voltage discharge. This is electrolocation. This is the electric eel sending out a signal from its sacs organ that it's using to locate a prey item successfully. When it sees that prey item there, then it's going to go into hunting mode, basically. Or not hunting mode, prey capture mode. Then the hunter's organ, which is this one along the bottom, is going to release a medium voltage pulse, slightly higher than the low voltage pulse, but nowhere near as high as the high voltage one. And that's going to go, it's going to be a little one, and then just after that, it's going to deploy a high voltage pulse, and it can go bam, 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 it can do multiple. Ray Dao only deploys those neck organs and flares them out during a high voltage pulse. And they always fire directly before. You can see arcs of electricity coming off of the neck for just a second before that electrical pulse goes out of the main electrical organ. These researchers hypothesized that the medium discharge from the hunter's organ might serve to help prevent systemic damage to the electric eel when it discharges all this electricity. And we know that Ray Dao can still be damaged by electricity. We know that it's not supernaturally resistant to it because there's this one video that I saw on Reddit where Ray Dao gets struck by lightning in the Windward Plains and it takes like 1,000 something damage, which is a lot. Ray Dao should not be trying to shock itself with its own electricity, and if it has the same adaptation as an electric eel, that would be a good way to prevent this kind of damage. Here is what I'm talking about, by the way. These organs are popping out of Ray Dao's neck, and they're going to be analogous to, where is it? This is the hunter's organ, and then this is the sacs organ, and then this is the main organ. So our main organ, I'll draw a green line here, those are going to be those big horns on the front, and then our purple organ, that's going to be those guys right there. And I'm not really sure where I would put the sacs organ on Ray Dao. Nothing is really screaming at me for the moment, but if indeed Ray Dao is doing electrolocation, then it would have a smaller organ dedicated to producing low-frequency charges to locate prey items. And so, yes, this is why, I hate to say it, I think Unnatural History Channel was a little bit incorrect about his assessment of what Ray Dao's organs are doing and the analogies that they represent. And with that, we have our concluding remarks. Ray Dao is the coolest animal, besides crocodilians. It's an exceptional and highly specialized predator, and it provides a really, really cool example of these consistent themes of secondarily terrestrial organisms that are moving into these arid environments. This is really, really starting to provide us some really good examples of the recent drop in sea level that just seems to be very apparent across the whole Monster Hunter universe. We see it in the Rotten Vale with Val Hazak. We see it in the Oil Well Basin with Gogmazios. We see it in the Windward Plains with Ray Dao. We see it also with petracants and a whole bunch of these other organisms. We see it with the gigantic coral reef in the Coral Highlands that absolutely is the victim of a recent sea level drop. This is something incredibly, incredibly pervasive and everywhere. It's everywhere in Monster Hunter. So this is another mounting piece of evidence to add to that. The 2 or 3 specialized electrical organs of Ray Dao are really cool, and they serve distinct functions as evidenced by their differently timed discharge. And Ray Dao's scales might be conductive and shunt energy towards the battery organs. Here is my works cited page. Thank you very much, everybody, if you made it this far. And a huge, huge thank you to all my paid supporters on TikTok, on YouTube, on everybody. You guys are all amazing. If you got to here, please like and subscribe. Feels like such a stupid thing to say, but it does mean a lot, and it helps me out significantly. So thank you, everybody, really, from the bottom of my heart. I really appreciate it if you made it through this behemoth of a video. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know any questions in the comments, any things I said that were stupid and terrible and incorrect that you'd like to inform me of, and what you'd like to see next from this channel. Because by golly do I have ideas, but I don't have a lot of them. I have maybe 3 videos that I know what I want to do with, and then beyond that it's up in the air. Not sure what the next video is going to be or necessarily when it's going to come out, but I'm sure it'll be soon enough. I'm trying to wrangle some of my
my colleagues to lend their expertise to some stuff that I'm not super knowledgeable about, so that I can make these videos as accurate as possible. With that being said, I hope everybody's doing lovely. And if you're listening to this, have a good night, a good day, good afternoon. If you're living on Venus, I hope you're having a good Venusian day as well. And I will see you when I see you.